In the depths of human ambition, where idealism transforms into tyranny and dreams become nightmares, stands the figure of a man whose vision would reshape the boundaries between utopia and hell. Beneath the crushing weight of the Atlantic Ocean, where no government could interfere and no parasite could feed, Andrew Ryan built a monument to his own philosophy, a city that would become both humanity's greatest achievement and its most profound moral failure. Tonight, we descend into the mind and motivations of the man who dared to play God beneath the waves, whose journey from victim to visionary to tyrant illuminates the terrible price of absolute conviction in an imperfect world. In the winter of 1917, as the Great War raged across Europe and empires crumbled beneath the weight of unprecedented carnage, a young boy named Andrei Ryanovsky lived with his family in a modest but comfortable home near the ancient city of Minsk, where the rhythms of middle-class Jewish life continued, despite the growing chaos that threatened to consume the Russian Empire. The Ryanovsky household represented the kind of modest success that had become possible for enterprising families who had managed to navigate the complex restrictions and opportunities available to Jewish citizens within the Tsarist system, combining traditional religious observance with the practical necessities of commerce and industry that enabled them to maintain their position within a society that viewed them with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. Andrei's father, Pietro Ryanovsky, had built a successful business through decades of careful planning and tireless work, establishing relationships with suppliers and customers that extended across the western regions of the Russian Empire, while maintaining the kind of low profile that enabled prosperous Jewish businessmen to avoid the attention of authorities who might view their success as somehow illegitimate or threatening to the established social order. The family's prosperity was modest by the standards of the Russian nobility or the emerging industrial magnates who controlled vast enterprises, but it was sufficient to provide Andrei with educational opportunities and cultural experiences that would shape his understanding of what individual effort and intelligence could achieve when properly applied and protected from the interference of those who sought to claim the fruits of others' labor. The world that Andrei knew during his early childhood was one where individual initiative and family loyalty provided the foundation for security and advancement, where success came to those who worked hardest and planned most carefully, while failure befell those who relied on others rather than their own capabilities. This worldview, reinforced by both Jewish cultural traditions that emphasized education and self-reliance, and the practical realities of life as a minority population within a frequently hostile society, created in young Andrei a deep appreciation for the connection between personal effort and material reward that would remain central to his philosophy throughout his life. Even as the circumstances that had taught him these lessons were swept away by forces beyond his family's control or understanding, the first cracks in Andrei's stable world appeared in the early months of 1917, as reports began to reach Minsk of military disasters, civilian unrest, and the growing inability of Tsar Nicholas II to maintain effective control over his vast empire. The war that had begun with patriotic enthusiasm and confident predictions of quick victory had become a grinding nightmare of unprecedented casualties and economic devastation that exposed the fundamental weaknesses of the Russian state, while creating opportunities for radical political movements that had previously existed only on the margins of society. For families like the Ryanovskys, whose prosperity depended on stable political conditions and predictable legal frameworks, the growing chaos represented not just inconvenience, but existential threat to everything they had worked to build. The Russian Revolution that erupted in February of 1917 initially appeared to offer hope for political reform and modernization that might create better conditions for business and individual advancement. As the abdication of the Tsar opened possibilities for constitutional government and legal protections for property rights that had never existed under the autocratic system. But these hopes were short-lived, as the provisional government that replaced the Tsarist regime proved unable to address the fundamental problems that had caused the revolution in the first place, while more radical political movements began organizing to seize power and implement far more dramatic changes to Russian society. The Bolshevik faction that would ultimately triumph in the revolutionary struggle represented everything that Pietro Rajanowski and others like him feared most about political upheaval, as their ideology explicitly rejected the legitimacy of private property and individual economic success, while promising to redistribute wealth from those who had earned it through their own efforts to those who had contributed nothing to its creation. The Bolshevik vision of social justice was based on the premise that existing inequalities were inherently illegitimate, products of exploitation, rather than differences in capability or effort, and that true progress required the complete elimination of private ownership and individual economic initiative in favor of collective control over all productive resources. When the Bolsheviks successfully seized control of the government in October of 1917, their first priority was to implement the radical social transformation they had promised their supporters, beginning with the mass nationalization of private property and the forcible redistribution of wealth from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat. The process by which this transformation was carried out was swift and ruthless, involving the systematic identification and confiscation of all privately owned businesses, properties, and financial assets that were deemed to represent exploitation of the working class. For families like the Rajanowskis, who had built their modest prosperity through legitimate business activities and personal sacrifice, the Bolshevik Revolution represented not liberation but catastrophic theft on an unprecedented scale. The sequence of events that destroyed Pietro Rajanowski's business and shattered his family's security unfolded with the mechanical efficiency that characterized Bolshevik social policy as party officials arrived at his establishment with legal documents that transferred ownership of his life's work to the state without compensation or appeal. The justification offered for this confiscation was that private ownership of productive enterprises constituted theft from the workers whose labor created value, and that the elimination of such theft was necessary for the establishment of true social justice. The fact that Pietro had built his business through his own labor and had provided employment and valuable services to his community was irrelevant to officials who viewed all private enterprise as inherently exploitative, regardless of the plummet circumstances of its creation or operation. The psychological impact of this confiscation on Andrei was profound and lasting, as he witnessed his father's transformation from confident businessman to powerless victim in the space of a single morning. The sight of armed men seizing property that had been acquired through legitimate means and declaring that its rightful owner no longer had any claim to the fruits of his own labor violated Andrei's fundamental understanding of justice and property rights in ways that would shape his worldview for the rest of his life. The revolution that claimed to represent the interests of working people had destroyed a working man's livelihood while offering nothing in return except ideological justifications that seemed to Andrei like elaborate rationalizations for simple theft. The broader campaign of terror that accompanied the Bolshevik consolidation of power extended far beyond mere property confiscation to include the systematic elimination of anyone who posed potential opposition to the new regime, including former property owners who might organize resistance or serve as focal points for counter-revolutionary activity. The Red Guard units that carried out these elimination campaigns operated with the authority of revolutionary justice, identifying enemies of the people and dealing with them according to the harsh logic of political necessity, rather than conventional legal procedures that might allow dangerous elements to escape or regroup. Andrei's aunt and uncle became victims of this campaign when they were identified as former property owners whose continued existence posed a threat to revolutionary stability, despite the fact that they had made no attempt to resist the new government or organize opposition to Bolshevik policies. Their execution was carried out without trial or legal process, based solely on their class background and the assumption that members of the bourgeoisie were inherently counter-revolutionary regardless of their actual behavior or intentions. For Andrei, who had known these relatives as kind and generous people whose only crime was their success in business, their murder represented the ultimate proof that the Bolshevik Revolution was not about justice, but about the systematic destruction of anyone who had achieved anything through their own efforts. The philosophical framework that Andrei began to develop in response to these traumatic experiences was based on a fundamental distinction between producers and parasites, between those who created value through their own efforts and those who sought to appropriate the results of others' work through political mechanisms. In Andrei's understanding, the Bolsheviks were the ultimate parasites, using political power to steal from productive individuals while contributing nothing themselves except ideological justifications for their theft. The revolution that claimed to represent the interests of working people had actually empowered the ultimate non-workers, political activists who had never created anything of value but who had mastered the art of taking from others what they had not earned. This analysis of the Russian Revolution would remain central to Andrei's worldview throughout his life, providing him with a conceptual framework for understanding political and economic systems that emphasized the fundamental conflict between producers and parasites, between those who earned their position through merit and effort, and those who sought to advance themselves through political manipulation and the appropriation of others' achievements. The trauma of witnessing his family's destruction would never fully heal, but it would serve as the foundation for a philosophy that celebrated individual achievement while condemning collective action as inherently parasitic. The practical necessity of escaping from the Bolshevik regime before they too became victims of revolutionary justice forced Pietro to abandon everything he had built in Russia and flee with his son to Constantinople, where they joined the flood of refugees who had chosen exile over submission to the new political order. The journey to Constantinople was difficult and dangerous, involving the navigation of borders controlled by hostile forces while carrying only those possessions that could be easily transported and concealed. For Andrei, this flight from his homeland represented not just physical displacement but the complete destruction of the stable world in which he had grown up, replaced by uncertainty and dependence on the charity of others. The 2 years that the Ryanowski family spent in Constantinople were marked by poverty, uncertainty, and the constant awareness that they were dependent on the goodwill of others for their basic survival. For Pietro, who had once been a successful businessman capable of providing for his family through his own efforts, this period of dependence and vulnerability was deeply humiliating and psychologically devastating. For Andrei, who observed his father's transformation from confident provider to desperate refugee, these years served as a powerful lesson about the fragility of security and the importance of being strong enough to protect what one had earned from those who would take it away. During this period of exile and reflection, Andrei began to formulate his own understanding of what had gone wrong in Russia and what lessons could be learned from the catastrophe that had destroyed his family's life. In his analysis, the fundamental problem was not merely the Bolshevik ideology or the particular personalities of revolutionary leaders, but the existence of political systems that enabled some people to live off the productive efforts of others, rather than being forced to earn their own way through individual achievement. The parasites who had destroyed Russia were not unique to that country or that historical moment, but representatives of a universal tendency among some human beings to seek unearned benefits at the expense of those who actually created value through their work and intelligence. The decision to emigrate to the United States of America in 1919 represented both a practical choice about where to rebuild their lives and a philosophical commitment to the principles of individual opportunity and limited government that America was supposed to represent. In Andre's understanding, America offered the closest approximation to an ideal society that existed in the real world, a place where individual merit could determine success without interference from parasitic political movements or established aristocracies that sought to prevent social mobility based on achievement rather than birth or political connections. The process of anglicizing his name from Andrzej Ryanowski to Andrew Ryan upon arriving in America was more than simply a practical adaptation to his new country's cultural expectations. It represented a conscious decision to create a new identity based on American principles of individual self-determination, rather than the ethnic and religious categories that had defined his place in Russian society. Andrew Ryan was a self-created man who would rise or fall based on his own capabilities and efforts, rather than Andrzej Ryanowski, who had been defined by circumstances beyond his control and vulnerable to forces that could destroy everything he valued without regard for justice or merit. The success that Andrew Ryan achieved in the American oil industry validated his philosophical commitment to the principles of individual achievement and free market competition, as he demonstrated that a man who had lost everything could rebuild his life through intelligence, hard work, and careful planning. The discovery of oil on land that he had purchased with his own money represented the kind of fortunate coincidence that favors those who position themselves to take advantage of opportunity, while the development of Ryan Oil into a major enterprise demonstrated his ability to transform natural resources into productive assets that benefited both himself and the broader society that purchased his products. The wealth that Ryan accumulated through his oil business exceeded anything his family had achieved in Russia, providing him with not just financial security but genuine power and independence that made him invulnerable to the kind of political persecution that had destroyed his father's life. This success served as practical proof of his philosophical beliefs about the relationship between individual effort and material reward, while also providing him with the resources that would eventually enable him to pursue far more ambitious projects than simple business success. The American dream had worked exactly as advertised for Andrew Ryan, confirming his faith in the principles of individual liberty and free market capitalism, while also positioning him to become a major advocate for these principles in their purest form. But even as Ryan's business success validated his faith in American principles, developments in American politics during the 1930s began to create disturbing parallels to the Russian experience that had traumatized his youth. The election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the 32nd President of the United States in 1933 brought to power a political philosophy that emphasized government intervention in the economy and the redistribution of wealth from successful individuals to those who had been less fortunate. While Roosevelt's New Deal programs were far less radical than Bolshevik policies, they represented the same fundamental principle that had destroyed Ryan's family in Russia: the idea that political authority could legitimately appropriate private property and redistribute it according to political rather than economic criteria, Roosevelt's focus on state-run social programs to help those who had not been as fortunate as people like Andrew Ryan represented exactly the kind of parasitic relationship that Ryan's philosophy identified as the fundamental threat to a free society. In Ryan's understanding, these programs encourage people to rely on political solutions rather than individual effort for their economic advancement, while simultaneously punishing successful individuals by forcing them to subsidize the failure of others. The philosophical framework underlying the New Deal was fundamentally collectivist, based on the premise that society as a whole bore responsibility for individual welfare, rather than expecting each person to earn their own way through productive effort. The specific incident that crystallized Ryan's opposition to Roosevelt's policies involved a government attempt to nationalize a forest that Ryan owned and used as a private retreat, converting it into a national park that would be accessible to the general public rather than remaining under the exclusive control of the man who had purchased it with his own money. This proposed nationalization represented exactly the kind of property confiscation that had destroyed Pietro Ryanovsky's business in Russia, differing only in its legal sophistication and public justification rather than its essential character as theft of legitimately acquired private property. Ryan's response to this threatened nationalization revealed both the depth of his philosophical commitment to property rights and the intensity of the psychological trauma that had shaped his worldview since childhood. His threat to burn the forest to the ground, rather than allow the government to convert it into public property, was not simply a negotiating tactic, but a genuine expression of his belief that destruction was preferable to submission to parasitic appropriation of his legitimate possessions. The forest represented not just economic value but the principle that a man's property belonged to him alone, and that any compromise on this principle was equivalent to accepting the legitimacy of the Bolshevik revolution that had destroyed his family. The philosophical parallels that Ryan identified between Roosevelt's New Deal and the Bolshevik Revolution were not merely rhetorical but reflected his genuine belief that the same underlying principles were at work in both cases, differing only in their degree of implementation rather than their essential character. Both political movements claimed to represent the interests of common people against wealthy elites. Both justified the appropriation of private property through appeals to social justice, and both created political mechanisms that enabled some people to live off the productive efforts of others, rather than earning their own way through individual achievement. The culmination of Ryan's disillusionment with American politics came with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, which represented to him the ultimate perversion of scientific achievement by political authority. In Ryan's understanding, the development of nuclear weapons represented the kind of breakthrough that human genius could achieve when freed from political interference. But the decision to use these weapons for mass destruction demonstrated how political systems inevitably corrupted and misdirected human achievement toward destructive rather than creative purposes. The same government that had threatened to steal his forest had now demonstrated its willingness to use the greatest scientific achievement in human history as an instrument of unprecedented destruction. The atomic bombings forced Ryan to confront the reality that even America, which had provided him with the opportunity to rebuild his life and validate his philosophical principles, was ultimately controlled by the same kind of parasitic political class that had destroyed Russia and now threatened to destroy the entire world through the militarization of human genius. The promise of American freedom and individual opportunity was real, but it existed within a political framework that could be corrupted by the same forces that had created the Bolshevik Revolution, and that corruption was already well advanced. The decision that began to form in Ryan's mind during this period was as radical as it was logical given his philosophical premises. If existing political systems inevitably became vehicles for parasitic exploitation of productive individuals, then the only solution was to create an entirely new kind of society where such exploitation would be impossible. The surface world, whether capitalist or communist, democratic or authoritarian, was fundamentally corrupted by the existence of political mechanisms that enabled some people to appropriate the achievements of others, and no reform of these systems could address this fundamental flaw. The vision that began to crystallize in Ryan's imagination was of a society where the great men and women of the world could work and create and achieve without interference from parasites, where individual merit would be the sole criterion for success, and where no political authority could appropriate the fruits of genius for redistribution to the undeserving. Such a society would need to be physically separated from the corrupted world of surface politics, hidden away where no government could find it and no parasite could infiltrate it, protected by barriers that were impassable to those who had not earned the right to participate in this community of achievement. The psychological transformation that had carried Andrei Ryanovsky from traumatized refugee to Andrew Ryan, successful businessman and emerging philosopher of radical individualism, was now ready to take its final form. The man who had witnessed the destruction of his childhood world by political parasites, and who had rebuilt his life through individual achievement in America, was prepared to undertake the most ambitious project in human history: the creation of a society where the conflict between producers and parasites could finally be resolved through the complete elimination of political mechanisms for parasitic exploitation. What began as childhood trauma had become adult philosophy, and what began as adult philosophy was about to become the foundation for reshaping human civilization itself. The realization that came to Andrew Ryan in the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was both simple and revolutionary in its implications. If the surface world had become irredeemably corrupted by the parasitic relationship between political authority and individual achievement, then the only solution was to abandon that world entirely and create something fundamentally new. The vision that began to crystallize in his mind during the late summer of 1945 was not merely of political reform or economic restructuring, but of complete separation from the systems that had proven themselves incapable of protecting human genius from the predations of those who sought to control and exploit it for their own purposes. The philosophical foundation that would underpin this unprecedented project was rooted in Ryan's conviction that human achievement required complete freedom from political interference, not merely reduced interference or reformed interference, but the total elimination of any mechanism by which some individuals could claim authority over the creative and productive efforts of others. The great men and women of history had always been constrained by the limitations imposed by governments, religions, and social institutions that sought to channel human potential toward collective purposes, rather than allowing it to flourish according to its own inherent logic and direction. The theoretical framework that Ryan developed during this period drew upon his understanding of both the Russian Revolution and the American New Deal as expressions of the same underlying principle, that individual achievement was somehow illegitimate unless it served broader social purposes, as defined by political authorities who had contributed nothing to that achievement except their willingness to claim control over it. The collectivist impulse that had destroyed his family in Russia was the same impulse that now threatened to corrupt American society through the expansion of government power and the redistribution of wealth from producers to parasites. But where others might have despaired at the apparent universality of this corruption, Ryan saw opportunity for a radical solution that would transcend the limitations of existing political systems by eliminating the possibility of political interference entirely. The key insight that would make this solution possible was the recognition that physical separation could provide what legal and constitutional protections had failed to achieve: a space where human genius could operate without constraint, where individual merit would be the sole criterion for success, and where no external authority could interfere with the natural relationship between effort and reward. The practical challenge of implementing this vision required Ryan to identify a location that would be simultaneously accessible to those who deserved to participate in this new form of society, while remaining completely hidden from and inaccessible to the parasitic forces that dominated surface civilization. The ocean depths represented the only remaining frontier on Earth that was still largely unexplored and unclaimed by existing governments, while also providing natural barriers that would make unauthorized access virtually impossible for those who lacked the resources and determination necessary to discover and reach such a remote location. The selection of a specific site for this unprecedented project required extensive research into oceanographic conditions, geological stability, and strategic considerations that would ensure both the feasibility of construction and the long-term security of the resulting community. The location that Ryan ultimately chose, approximately 433 kilometers west of Reykjavik in the North Atlantic, offered the ideal combination of accessible depth for construction purposes, geological stability to support massive structural foundations, and sufficient isolation to prevent accidental discovery by surface vessels or government surveillance operations. The engineering challenges that would be involved in constructing a habitable city at such depths were unprecedented in human history, requiring advances in materials, science, structural engineering, and life support systems that pushed far beyond existing technological capabilities. The pressure differential between the ocean depths and normal atmospheric conditions meant that every aspect of the city's design would need to account for forces that could crush conventional structures instantly, while the need to maintain breathable atmosphere and comfortable temperatures would require closed-loop life support systems of extraordinary complexity and reliability. The financial requirements for such a project exceeded the resources of most national governments, representing an investment that would consume the majority of Ryan's substantial wealth, while also requiring additional funding from other sources who shared his vision of a society based on pure individual merit. The economic analysis that Ryan conducted during the planning phases revealed that the initial construction costs would be enormous, but that the long-term benefits of creating a community of the world's most talented and productive individuals would generate returns that would more than justify the investment. The recruitment strategy that Ryan developed for attracting the kind of individuals who would be worthy of participation in this new society required careful identification of those whose achievements demonstrated genuine merit rather than mere social connections or political favor. The artists, scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs who would form the foundation of this community would need to possess not only exceptional talent in their respective fields, but also the philosophical commitment to individualism that would make them compatible with the radical principles underlying the entire project. The architectural vision that began to emerge from Ryan's planning process reflected his belief that physical environment could both express and reinforce philosophical principles, with design elements that would constantly remind residents of their commitment to individual achievement and their rejection of collectivist ideology. The Art Deco aesthetic that would characterize the city's buildings and public spaces was chosen specifically because it represented the triumph of human creativity and technical mastery over natural limitations, embodying in visual form the same principles that governed the social and economic organization of the community. The legal and organizational framework that would govern this new society required the development of entirely new approaches to law and administration that would protect individual rights while eliminating the political mechanisms through which parasitic exploitation typically occurred. The system that Ryan designed was based on the principle that the only legitimate function of authority was the protection of individual property rights and the enforcement of voluntary contracts. with no provision for redistribution of wealth or regulation of economic activity beyond the prevention of fraud and coercion. The great chain philosophy that would serve as the ideological foundation for this society was based on Ryan's understanding that human progress occurred through the voluntary cooperation of talented individuals pursuing their own rational self-interest, with each person's achievements contributing to the overall advancement of the community, without requiring any central planning or coordination. The metaphor of the chain emphasized both the independence of each individual link and the strength that emerged from their connection to one another through mutual benefit rather than mutual obligation. The principle that Ryan articulated as "no gods, no kings, only man" represented a complete rejection of all external authorities that claimed the right to direct or constrain human achievement, whether those authorities derived their legitimacy from religious tradition, political power, or social convention. In the society that Ryan envisioned, the only authority would be the natural authority of superior achievement, with respect and influence flowing to those who demonstrated their worth through their accomplishments, rather than their ability to manipulate political processes or claim divine sanction. The construction phase that began in the late autumn of 1945 represented the largest private engineering project ever undertaken, requiring the coordination of thousands of workers, hundreds of specialized contractors, and dozens of cutting-edge technology companies whose combined efforts would transform Ryan's vision into physical reality. The secrecy requirements that surrounded this project necessitated the creation of an elaborate network of shell companies, front organizations, and false documentation that would conceal the true nature and scope of the work from government investigators who might seek to interfere with or appropriate the results. The shell company network that Ryan established to manage the acquisition of materials and services for the construction project was a masterpiece of financial engineering that distributed the apparent ownership and control of the project across dozens of seemingly unrelated entities while maintaining centralized coordination through hidden connections that only Ryan and his closest associates fully understood. The complexity of this system was necessary to prevent any government agency from recognizing the scale and implications of what was being undertaken, while also ensuring that no single point of failure could compromise the entire operation. The recruitment of construction workers for this unprecedented project required careful screening to identify individuals who possessed both the necessary technical skills and the personal characteristics that would make them suitable for work on such a sensitive and isolated operation. The men who were ultimately selected for the most critical phases of construction were chosen not only for their engineering expertise, but also for their philosophical compatibility with Ryan's vision and their willingness to maintain absolute secrecy about their involvement in the project. The engineering challenges that emerged during the construction process required continuous innovation and problem-solving that pushed the boundaries of existing technology while also creating new techniques and materials that would have applications far beyond the immediate requirements of the underwater city. The pressure-resistant materials that were developed for the city's hull represented advances in metallurgy that were decades ahead of anything available to surface industries, while the life support systems that were designed to maintain comfortable atmospheric conditions required breakthroughs in chemical engineering and environmental control. The architectural features that distinguished Ryan's underwater city from any previous human settlement reflected both practical necessity and aesthetic philosophy, combining functional requirements for structural integrity and environmental control with visual elements that would inspire and elevate the spirits of those who would live and work in this unprecedented environment. The soaring atriums and grand staircases that connected different levels of the city were designed to create a sense of openness and freedom that would counteract any psychological effects of living beneath the ocean, while the extensive use of glass and steel emphasized the triumph of human technology over natural constraints. The artistic program that was integrated into the city's design from its earliest phases reflected Ryan's belief that great architecture should serve not merely functional purposes, but also educational and inspirational ones, surrounding residents with constant reminders of human achievement and potential, while reinforcing the philosophical principles that governed their community. The sculptural elements, decorative panels, and mural paintings that adorn the city's public spaces were commissioned from artists whose work celebrated individual creativity and technical mastery, while avoiding the collectivist themes that had come to dominate much of contemporary art. The symbolic significance of constructing this city beneath the ocean was not lost on Ryan or on those who would eventually become its residents, as the depth that protected them from surface interference also served as a powerful metaphor for the profundity of their commitment to principles that the surface world had abandoned or betrayed. The crushing pressure that surrounded their city was analogous to the political and social pressures that had driven them to seek refuge in this hidden sanctuary, while the artificial environment they had created represented humanity's capacity to transcend natural limitations through intelligence and determination. The timeline that governed the construction project was driven partly by engineering requirements and partly by Ryan's growing sense of urgency about the deteriorating conditions on the surface, as evidence accumulated that the corruption he had identified in American politics was spreading and deepening in ways that would soon make escape impossible for those who refused to submit to collectivist orthodoxy. The project that had begun as a long-term vision was increasingly becoming a desperate race against time to create a refuge for human civilization before the surface world succumbed completely to the parasitic forces that would destroying individual freedom and achievement. The moment of completion that arrived on November 5th, 1946, represented not just the successful conclusion of the most ambitious construction project in human history, but the birth of an entirely new form of human society, based on principles that had never been fully implemented anywhere in the world. The infrastructure that had been completed was sufficient to support the initial population of residents who would begin arriving immediately, while also providing the foundation for continued expansion as more worthy individuals were identified and invited to join the community. The emotional impact of seeing the completed city for the first time was overwhelming for Ryan and for the small group of associates who had shared his vision throughout the long planning and construction process, as the physical reality of their achievement exceeded even their most optimistic expectations, while simultaneously validating the philosophical principles that had motivated their unprecedented sacrifice and effort. The elegant galleries and spacious residential areas that had been carved from the ocean floor represented humanity's capacity to create beauty and comfort in the most hostile environments, while the advanced technology that made life possible at such depths demonstrated the heights that human genius could achieve when freed from political interference. The population that began to arrive during the first months following the city's completion represented a carefully selected cross-section of the world's most talented and accomplished individuals, each chosen not only for their professional achievements, but also for their philosophical commitment to the principles of individualism and voluntary cooperation that would govern their new society. The artists, scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs who became the city's first residents shared Ryan's vision of a community where personal merit would be the sole criterion for success, and where no external authority could interfere with the natural relationship between effort and reward. The cultural flowering that began almost immediately upon the city's opening reflected the extraordinary creative potential that was unleashed when talented individuals were freed from the constraints and distractions that had limited their achievements in the surface world. The scientific research that was conducted in the city's laboratories produced breakthroughs that were decades ahead of surface developments, while the artistic works that emerged from its studios and theaters represented new heights of creative expression that had been impossible to achieve under the censorship and ideological pressures that dominated surface cultural institutions. The economic system that emerged organically from the interactions of these exceptional individuals validated Ryan's belief that free market principles, when implemented in their purest form, would produce prosperity and innovation that exceeded anything possible under systems that involved government interference or wealth redistribution. The businesses that were established in the city were based entirely on voluntary exchanges between consenting parties, with success determined by the value that each enterprise provided to its customers rather than by political connections or regulatory advantages. The social order that developed during the city's early years reflected the natural hierarchy that Ryan believed would emerge when artificial barriers to achievement were eliminated, and individuals were free to rise or fall based on their own capabilities and efforts. The respect and influence that flowed to the most accomplished residents was based on their demonstrated achievements rather than their social backgrounds or political affiliations, creating a meritocratic system that rewarded excellence while providing opportunities for continued advancement based on performance rather than privilege. The infrastructure that Ryan had constructed to support this community was designed to be largely self-sufficient, with internal systems for power generation, water purification, food production, and waste management that would eliminate dependence on surface suppliers who might be influenced by governments hostile to the city's principles. The technological sophistication of these systems exceeded anything available in the surface world, reflecting the same commitment to excellence that characterized every aspect of the city's design and operation. The rule that prohibited communication with the surface world was not merely a security measure, but a philosophical statement about the fundamental incompatibility between the city's principles and the corrupted values that dominated surface civilization. The residents who had chosen to join this community had necessarily abandoned their previous lives and relationships in order to participate in an experiment that required complete commitment and absolute loyalty to principles that the previous lives surface world had rejected. The success that the city achieved during its first years of operation validated every aspect of Ryan's vision, while also confirming his analysis of the problems that plagued surface society. As the prosperity and achievement that flourished in the underwater sanctuary demonstrated what human potential could accomplish when freed from parasitic interference. The technological advances, artistic achievements, and economic growth that characterized the city's early development were direct results of implementing the principles of pure individualism that Ryan had articulated as alternatives to the collectivist ideologies that had corrupted surface civilization. But even as the city's success validated Ryan's philosophical beliefs, the very magnitude of that success began to generate new challenges that had not been anticipated during the planning phases. As the community of exceptional individuals that Ryan had assembled began to develop its own internal dynamics and power relationships that would eventually threaten the principles on which their society had been founded. The seeds of future conflict were already present in the early years of the city's existence, growing from the same individualistic principles that had made the community's initial success possible, waiting for the proper conditions to germinate and eventually transform paradise into something far more complex and troubling than its creator had ever imagined. The morning of November 5th, 1946, marked not merely the opening of an extraordinary city beneath the Atlantic Ocean, but the birth of what Andrew Ryan believed would be humanity's most perfect expression of individual achievement and collective prosperity. The first residents who descended through the elaborate airlock systems and stepped into the marble-floored galleries of their new home found themselves in an environment that exceeded even their most optimistic expectations, as the soaring architecture and elegant appointments that surrounded them represented a synthesis of aesthetic beauty and technological sophistication that had never been achieved in any previous human settlement. The emotional impact of this moment was profound for those who experienced it firsthand, as the transition from the familiar constraints of surface life to the unlimited possibilities of their underwater sanctuary represented not merely a change of address, but a fundamental transformation in their understanding of what human civilization could achieve when freed from the parasitic interference that had limited progress throughout recorded history. The residents who gathered in the central plaza during those first hours of operation were conscious that they were participating in an unprecedented experiment that would determine whether Ryan's philosophical vision could be translated into practical reality. The population that Ryan had assembled for this historic moment represented the most carefully selected collection of human talent ever brought together in a single location, as each individual had been chosen not only for their demonstrated achievements in their respective fields, but also for their philosophical commitment to the principles of radical individualism that would govern their new society. The artists who had accepted Ryan's invitation included painters, sculptors, musicians, and writers whose work had been constrained by censorship and commercial pressures in the surface world, while the scientists represented the most innovative researchers in fields ranging from physics and chemistry to biology and psychology. The engineers and inventors who formed another crucial segment of the initial population brought with them expertise in technologies that were decades ahead of surface developments, along with ambitious plans for research and development projects that would have been impossible to pursue under the regulatory constraints and resource limitations that characterized surface institutions. The entrepreneurs and business leaders who completed the founding population possessed not only the practical skills necessary to establish and operate commercial enterprises, but also the vision to recognize opportunities that would emerge from the unique conditions of their underwater environment. The architectural framework that these exceptional individuals encountered upon their arrival had been designed to inspire and elevate their spirits, while simultaneously providing the practical facilities necessary to support advanced research, artistic creation, and commercial development. The grand atrium that served as the city's central gathering space featured soaring ceilings and elegant staircases that created a sense of openness and freedom despite the enclosed nature of their environment, while the extensive use of glass walls and Art Deco decorative elements emphasized the transparency and aesthetic sophistication that Ryan believed should characterize a truly advanced civilization. The residential areas that had been prepared for the city's inhabitants reflected the same attention to beauty and functionality that characterized the public spaces, with each apartment and suite designed to provide comfortable living conditions, while also serving as private studios and workshops where residents could pursue their creative and intellectual interests without interruption or interference. The integration of living and working spaces reflected Ryan's understanding that the most productive individuals required environments that supported both their professional activities and their personal needs without artificial separation between work and leisure. The technological infrastructure that supported daily life in the underwater city represented achievements in engineering and materials science that were years ahead of anything available in the surface world, as the unique challenges of maintaining atmospheric pressure, temperature control, and breathable air at such depths had required innovations that pushed the boundaries of existing knowledge, while creating systems of unprecedented reliability and efficiency. The power generation facilities that provided electricity for the entire city utilized advanced hydroelectric and thermal systems that converted the ocean environment from a hostile force into a source of unlimited clean energy. The life support systems that maintained comfortable atmospheric conditions throughout the city were marvels of environmental engineering that recycled air and water with near-perfect efficiency, while also providing controlled ventilation and climate regulation that could accommodate the diverse needs and preferences of the city's residents. The sophisticated filtration and purification systems that processed all water and air within the city eliminated contaminants and pollutants, while maintaining optimal chemical balances for human health and comfort. The scientific research facilities that had been constructed during the city's development phase provided equipment and capabilities that exceeded those available at the most advanced surface universities and research institutions, while the absence of government oversight and regulatory interference meant that researchers were free to pursue investigations that might have been prohibited or restricted in surface laboratories. The physics laboratories were equipped with particle accelerators and experimental apparatus that enabled studies of atomic and subatomic phenomena that had never been possible before, while the chemistry facilities provided controlled environments for synthesis and analysis of materials that had theoretical but not yet practical applications. The biological research capabilities that were available to the city's scientists included facilities for genetic research and modification that were decades ahead of surface developments, along with access to deep-sea specimens and environmental conditions that provided unique opportunities for studying life forms and biological processes that had never been examined by surface researchers. The medical facilities that served the city's population were equipped not only to provide conventional healthcare, but also to conduct experimental treatments and enhancement procedures that represented revolutionary advances in human biology and performance optimization. The artistic facilities that had been created for the city's creative residents provided studios, theaters, galleries, and performance spaces that were designed to support every form of artistic expression, while also showcasing completed works in settings that would inspire both creators and audiences to pursue ever higher levels of aesthetic achievement. The concert halls and theaters were equipped with acoustic systems that rivaled the finest surface venues, while the galleries and exhibition spaces provided elegant settings for displaying visual arts under lighting conditions that had been optimized to enhance the beauty and impact of creative works. The cultural flowering that began almost immediately upon the city's opening exceeded even Ryan's most optimistic predictions, as the combination of exceptional talent, unlimited resources, and complete creative freedom produced artistic achievements that represented new heights of human expression, while also pioneering entirely new forms and techniques that had been impossible to develop under the constraints of surface society. The musical compositions that emerged from the city's studios incorporated innovative harmonic structures and instrumental techniques that expanded the boundaries of what was considered possible in sonic art, while the visual artworks that were created in the city's galleries explored aesthetic concepts that had been theoretical rather than practical in surface environments. The scientific breakthroughs that occurred during the city's first months of operation validated Ryan's belief that human intelligence could achieve unprecedented advances when freed from political interference and resource constraints, as researchers working in the city's laboratories made discoveries that were years ahead of surface developments, while also pioneering entirely new fields of investigation that had been impossible to pursue under conventional academic and government oversight. The physics research that was conducted in the city's advanced facilities led to insights into the fundamental nature of matter and energy that revolutionized theoretical understanding, while also providing practical applications for energy generation and materials engineering. The economic system that emerged organically from the interactions of the city's residents demonstrated the validity of Ryan's free market philosophy in its purest form. As businesses and commercial enterprises developed through voluntary associations and mutually beneficial exchanges without any government intervention or regulatory oversight. The marketplace that developed in the city's commercial districts featured goods and services that reflected the advanced technological and artistic capabilities of the residents, while competition between enterprises ensured that prices reflected genuine value rather than artificial scarcities or monopolistic advantages. The prosperity that resulted from this pure free market system exceeded anything that had been achieved in surface economies that were burdened by government interference and wealth redistribution, as the absence of taxation, regulation, and bureaucratic overhead allowed productive activity to generate wealth that directly benefited those who created it, rather than being siphoned off by parasitic political institutions. The businesses that thrived in this environment were those that provided genuine value to their customers through superior products or services, while enterprises that failed to meet market demands were eliminated through natural competitive processes rather than being artificially sustained through government subsidies or protection. The social order that developed during the city's early years reflected the natural hierarchy that Ryan had predicted would emerge when artificial barriers to achievement were eliminated and individuals were free to rise or fall based on their own capabilities and efforts. The respect and influence that flowed to the most accomplished residents was based entirely on their demonstrated achievements rather than their social backgrounds, political connections, or inherited wealth, creating a truly meritocratic system that rewarded excellence while providing opportunities for continued advancement based on performance rather than privilege. The Ryan Industries empire that had financed the city's construction naturally evolved into the largest and most influential business organization within the new society, as Ryan's vision and resources had made the entire enterprise possible, while his continued leadership provided strategic direction for the community's development. The various divisions of Ryan Industries that operated within the city included the power generation facilities that provided electricity to all residents, the atmospheric processing systems that maintained breathable air throughout the enclosed environment, and the transportation networks that connected different areas of the city, while also providing access to the surface world for those rare occasions when such contact was necessary. The apartments and residential facilities that were managed by Ryan Industries represented some of the most luxurious and technologically advanced living spaces ever created, featuring amenities and conveniences that exceeded anything available in surface accommodations, while also providing the privacy and security that creative and intellectual individuals required for their most productive work. The rental agreements and residential contracts that governed these living arrangements were based on purely commercial terms that reflected the value provided to residents, rather than involving any subsidies or artificial price controls that might distort market relationships. The Rapture Central Council that Ryan had established as a minimal governmental structure was activated only rarely, and for specific emergencies that required coordinated community response, as the vast majority of decisions that affected residents were made through private negotiations and voluntary agreements rather than through political processes. The council members who had been selected to serve in these limited governmental roles were chosen for their demonstrated competence and their philosophical commitment to minimal interference in private affairs, with their authority strictly limited to those situations where individual action was insufficient to address community-wide challenges. The success of this minimal government approach validated Ryan's belief that most functions traditionally performed by government agencies could be handled more efficiently and effectively through private enterprise and voluntary cooperation, as the absence of bureaucratic overhead and political interference allowed resources to be allocated according to genuine needs and priorities, rather than according to political considerations and special interest pressures. The public services that were provided within the city, including transportation, communication, and emergency response capabilities, were operated as commercial enterprises that competed for customers based on the quality and value of their services. The technological advances that emerged from the city's research and development activities during its first year of operation included innovations in materials, science, energy generation, and environmental control that were decades ahead of surface developments, while also opening entirely new possibilities for human achievement and expansion into previously inaccessible environments. The metallurgical breakthroughs that were achieved in the city's laboratories produced alloys and composites that combined strength, lightness, and durability in combinations that had been theoretically possible, but practically unachievable using surface manufacturing techniques. The energy technologies that were developed through collaboration between the city's scientists and engineers included power generation systems that converted thermal, kinetic, and chemical energy with unprecedented efficiency, while also creating storage and distribution systems that could provide reliable electricity for the entire community without dependence on surface power sources or fossil fuel supplies. The environmental control systems that maintained optimal atmospheric conditions throughout the city incorporated biological and chemical processes that recycled air and water with near-perfect efficiency, while also creating closed-loop systems that eliminated waste and pollution. The communication and information systems that connected residents throughout the city represented advances in electronic and computational technology that enabled instant communication, information sharing, and collaborative work between individuals and groups, regardless of their physical location within the community. The public address system that allowed important announcements to be broadcast throughout the city used audio reproduction technology that provided crystal-clear communication, while also serving as a medium for musical and artistic performances that could be enjoyed by all residents simultaneously. The cultural institutions that developed during the city's early years included libraries, museums, theaters, and educational facilities that provided resources and opportunities for intellectual and artistic development that exceeded anything available in surface communities, while the absence of censorship and ideological pressure meant that these institutions could focus entirely on excellence and achievement rather than political correctness or social engineering objectives. The library collections that were assembled for the city's residents included both classical works that represented the finest achievements of human civilization and cutting-edge research and creative works that pushed the placeal boundaries of knowledge and artistic expression. The educational programs that were available to residents who wished to develop new skills or deepen their understanding of specific subjects were designed and implemented by the most accomplished practitioners in each field, providing instruction and mentorship opportunities that would have been impossible to obtain through surface institutions that were constrained by bureaucratic requirements and standardized curricula. The research seminars and collaborative projects that brought together experts from different fields created interdisciplinary opportunities for innovation and discovery that had been rare or impossible in surface academic environments. The entertainment and recreational facilities that were provided for the city's residents reflected the same commitment to excellence and innovation that characterized all aspects of the community, with venues and activities that were designed to stimulate and inspire rather than merely to provide passive diversion. The sporting facilities that were constructed within the city included swimming pools, gymnasiums, and courts for various athletic activities that provided opportunities for physical exercise and competitive recreation, while also serving as gathering places where residents could interact socially and build relationships outside their professional activities. The dining and hospitality establishments that emerged in the city's commercial districts offered cuisine and service that reflected the international backgrounds and sophisticated tastes of the residents, with restaurants and clubs that provided social environments where individuals could relax and enjoy themselves, while also engaging in the kind of informal conversations and networking that often led to collaborative projects and business partnerships. The quality of food and beverage that was available in these establishments exceeded anything that could be obtained in surface restaurants, as the absence of regulatory constraints and the presence of exceptional culinary talent created opportunities for innovation and excellence that would have been impossible in conventional commercial environments. The transportation systems that connected different areas of the city included both public transit options and private vehicle access that provided efficient and convenient movement throughout the community, while also serving as showcases for advanced engineering and design principles that demonstrated the technological capabilities of the residents. The bathysphere and submarine transportation that provided access between the city and surface locations when necessary utilized propulsion and navigation systems that represented significant advances over surface maritime technology, while also providing safe and comfortable travel conditions for passengers who needed to conduct business or maintain relationships in the outside world. The security and safety systems that protected the city and its residents were based on advanced detection and response technologies that could identify and address potential threats before they could cause harm to people or property, while the community's isolation and secrecy provided natural protection against most forms of external interference or attack. The emergency response capabilities that were maintained within the city included medical, fire suppression, and structural repair services that could address any conceivable crisis or disaster, while maintaining the high standards of safety and reliability that were essential for life in such a unique and challenging environment. The philosophical discussions and intellectual exchanges that occurred among the city's residents during social gatherings and formal presentations created an atmosphere of continuous learning and intellectual stimulation that reinforced the community's commitment to excellence and achievement, while also providing opportunities for personal growth and development that would have been rare or impossible in surface society. The absence of political correctness and ideological pressure meant that these discussions could explore controversial topics and challenging ideas without fear of censorship or social persecution. But even as the city's remarkable success during its first year validated every aspect of Ryan's vision, while demonstrating the unprecedented achievements that were possible when human talent was freed from parasitic interference, subtle changes were beginning to occur in the community's social dynamics that would eventually grow into the challenges and conflicts that would threaten the paradise that had been so carefully constructed. The very success of the community was creating new forms of inequality and competition that had not been anticipated during the planning phases, while the personalities and ambitions of some residents were beginning to generate tensions that would test the philosophical foundations upon which their society had been built. The increasing prosperity and technological sophistication of the city was creating opportunities for some residents to accumulate wealth and influence that exceeded what others could achieve, even within this community of exceptional individuals. While the natural hierarchies that emerged from differences in talent and achievement were beginning to solidify into more permanent class distinctions that resembled the social stratification that had characterized surface societies. The businesses and enterprises that had been most successful during the city's early development were beginning to dominate their respective markets, while also accumulating resources that could be used to influence community decisions and shape the future development of the society. Ryan himself was experiencing a gradual transformation from visionary leader to powerful authority figure, as his role in creating and financing the city naturally evolved into a position of continuing influence and control that went far beyond what his original philosophy had envisioned as appropriate for any individual within a truly free society. The success of his vision was simultaneously validating his beliefs and corrupting his commitment to the principles that had motivated his creation of this unprecedented experiment in human civilization, setting the stage for the moral and philosophical challenges that would eventually transform paradise into something far more complex and troubling than its creator had ever intended. In the thermal vents and volcanic trenches that surrounded Rapture's foundation, where superheated water created oases of biological activity in the otherwise barren depths of the Atlantic Ocean floor, a discovery was made that would transform Andrew Ryan's underwater paradise from a sanctuary of human achievement into something far more complex and morally ambiguous than its creator had ever intended. The sea slugs that thrived in these extreme environments possessed within their primitive biological systems a substance that would prove to be the most powerful agent of genetic transformation ever encountered by human science. A compound that would simultaneously represent the ultimate vindication of Ryan's faith in human potential and the instrument of his community's eventual corruption. Dr. Brigitte Tenenbaum, the German geneticist whose wartime research into human experimentation had made her both brilliantly insightful and morally compromised, was conducting routine surveys of the deep-sea life forms that populated the waters surrounding Rapture when she first encountered the specimens that would revolutionize her understanding of biological possibility. Her background in genetic manipulation and cellular biology, combined with her willingness to pursue research directions that more ethically constrained scientists might have avoided, made her uniquely qualified to recognize the extraordinary potential contained within these unremarkable creatures that had been overlooked by decades of marine biological research conducted by surface institutions that lacked both the access to these extreme environments and the philosophical freedom to pursue their implications without regard for conventional ethical limitations. The substance that Tenenbaum isolated from the sea slug specimens defied conventional understanding of genetic science, displaying properties that seemed to violate fundamental principles of cellular biology, while demonstrating effects that bordered on the miraculous in their scope and reliability. She designated this compound ADAM, choosing an acronym that reflected both its role in cellular reconstruction and its biblical significance as the raw material from which new forms of life could be created through scientific intervention rather than evolutionary processes that had previously constrained the development of biological organisms within the limitations imposed by natural selection and environmental pressures that had shaped life on Earth for billions of years. ADAM appeared to function as a universal genetic modifier, capable of rewriting the fundamental instructions that govern cellular development and tissue formation in ways that could produce dramatic and controllable changes in human physiology within remarkably short periods of time, transforming the recipient's biology according to predetermined parameters that could be established through careful analysis of desired outcomes and systematic application of the compound's transformative properties. Unlike conventional mutagenic substances that typically caused random and often harmful alterations to genetic structure, Adam seemed to possess an inherent intelligence that enabled it to make purposeful modifications that enhanced rather than degraded the organisms that were exposed to its transformative effects, suggesting possibilities for human improvement that had been theoretical rather than practical in all previous genetic research. The cellular mechanisms through which Adam achieved its remarkable effects remained largely mysterious even to the scientists who studied it most intensively. As the compound appeared to operate at levels of biological organization that were far more fundamental than anything that had been accessible to previous research methodologies. The substance seemed to interact directly with the stem cells that served as the foundation for all tissue development and regeneration, reprogramming these cellular building blocks to produce entirely new types of tissue and organ systems that possessed capabilities far beyond anything that natural evolution had achieved through millions of years of gradual development and environmental adaptation. The initial experiments that Tenenbaum conducted with carefully purified Adam samples revealed capabilities that exceeded even her most optimistic expectations based on her extensive experience with genetic manipulation, as the compound demonstrated the ability to regenerate damaged tissue, enhance physical strength and endurance, grant entirely new sensory capabilities, and even produce cognitive improvements that expanded the intellectual capacity of test subjects beyond normal human limitations. The regenerative properties alone represented a revolutionary advance in medical science that could eliminate most forms of disease and injury while extending human lifespan far beyond anything that had been achieved through conventional ATS medicine, while the enhancement effects suggested possibilities for human evolution that could be achieved within individual lifetimes rather than across multiple generations, through the slow processes of natural selection and genetic drift. But the true revolutionary potential of Adam became apparent only when Tenenbaum began to understand the mechanism by which the compound achieved its remarkable effects, recognizing that it functioned not merely as a passive mutagen, but as an active biological system that could be programmed to produce specific alterations in genetic expression and cellular development according to predetermined parameters, established through careful research and systematic experimentation. This programmability meant that Adam could potentially be used to create deliberate and predictable modifications to human biology, transforming genetic engineering from an unpredictable art based on trial and error into a precise science that could be applied systematically to solve specific problems or achieve particular enhancement goals with reliability, consistency that had never been possible in previous approaches to biological modification. The implications of this discovery extended far beyond the immediate applications that Tenenbaum envisioned for medical treatment and human performance optimization, suggesting possibilities for biological modification that could revolutionize every aspect of human existence, from physical capabilities and intellectual capacity to emotional responses and sensory perception, creating opportunities for species-level advancement that could transcend the limitations that natural evolution had imposed on human development. The compound offered the prospect of eliminating genetic diseases and inherited disabilities, while also enabling enhancements that could expand human capabilities far beyond anything that natural selection had produced. creating opportunities for deliberate evolution that could be directed by human intelligence rather than left to the random processes of environmental pressure and genetic mutation that had shaped biological development throughout the folding history of life on Earth. The economic potential of Adam was equally staggering, as the compound's unique properties made it potentially more valuable than any natural resource that had ever been discovered, while its scarcity and the technical complexity of its extraction and processing created opportunities for enormous profits for those who could control its production and distribution systems. Andrew Ryan recognized immediately that Adam represented not just a scientific breakthrough, but an economic foundation that could sustain Rapture's independence from the surface world, while providing the financial resources necessary to fund continued expansion and development of his underwater civilization beyond anything that had been previously possible with conventional economic resources and traditional forms of wealth generation. The challenge of extracting and refining Adam from its natural sources proved to be extraordinarily complex, as the compound was present in only minute quantities within the sea slug specimens and was highly unstable when removed from its original biological context, requiring sophisticated laboratory equipment and techniques that pushed the boundaries of existing biochemical knowledge, while also demanding precision and control that exceeded anything that had been achieved in previous biological research programs. The extraction process demanded levels of accuracy and consistency that were difficult to achieve even with the most advanced scientific instruments available in Rapture's research facilities, while the purification and stabilization procedures required entirely new approaches to biochemical processing that had to be developed specifically for this unprecedented substance, with properties that challenged conventional understanding of biological chemistry and molecular behavior. The sea slugs themselves proved to be remarkably fragile creatures whose biological systems could be easily disrupted by conventional collection and laboratory techniques, requiring the development of specialized handling procedures and environmental controls that could maintain the specimens in conditions that preserved their Adam-producing capabilities. The delicate balance of temperature, pressure, and chemical composition that these creatures required for optimal Adam production meant that the extraction facilities had to replicate the extreme conditions of the deep ocean thermal vents where the slugs naturally thrived, creating technical challenges that demanded innovations in environmental control and life support systems. Dr. Yi Su-chong, whose expertise in applied genetics and willingness to pursue research directions that more ethically constrained scientists might avoid, made him an ideal collaborator for projects that required both technical innovation and moral flexibility. Became deeply involved in the Adam research program as the practical challenges of working with the compound became apparent, and the need for systematic approaches to its development became increasingly urgent. Su-chong's background in experimental biology and his systematic approach to problem-solving complemented Tenenbaum's theoretical knowledge, while his ruthless pragmatism enabled him to focus on achieving results without being distracted by ethical considerations that might have slowed or prevented the research from reaching its full potential for transforming human biology and expanding the possibilities for genetic enhancement. The partnership between Tenenbaum and Su-chong represented a formidable combination of theoretical understanding and practical application, as their complementary skills enabled them to overcome technical obstacles that might have proven insurmountable for researchers working independently or within the ethical constraints that characterized surface research institutions bound by government regulations and moral oversight committees. Tenenbaum's deep understanding of genetic theory provided the conceptual framework necessary to understand Adam's mechanisms of action and predict the outcomes of various experimental approaches, while Su-chong's expertise in laboratory techniques and experimental design enabled them to translate theoretical possibilities into practical procedures that could be reliably implemented and systematically improved through iterative refinement and optimization. The early human trials of ADAM revealed both the extraordinary potential and the significant risks associated with the compound. As test subjects experienced dramatic improvements in physical and mental capabilities, while also displaying unpredictable side effects that ranged from minor cosmetic alterations to profound psychological changes that transformed their basic personality structures and behavioral patterns in ways that were not immediately apparent, but became increasingly significant over time. The enhancement effects were undeniable and impressive, demonstrating that human beings could indeed be modified to possess capabilities that far exceeded natural limitations. But these improvements came at costs that were not immediately apparent, and that would only become fully understood after years of continued research and careful observation of long-term effects on both individual users and the broader social systems in which they participated. The physiological changes that occurred in test subjects included alterations to muscle structure and bone density that increased physical strength and endurance far beyond natural human limits, while neurological modifications enhanced cognitive processing speed and memory capacity in ways that enabled mental performance that had previously been considered impossible. The sensory enhancements that some subjects experienced included improved visual acuity, enhanced hearing sensitivity, and entirely new forms of perception that could detect electromagnetic fields, chemical signatures, and other environmental features that were normally invisible to human senses. The first commercial applications of ADAM focused on medical treatments for conditions that had previously been considered incurable or untreatable, as the compound's regenerative properties offered hope for patients suffering from degenerative diseases, traumatic injuries, and genetic disorders that conventional medicine could not address effectively through existing therapeutic approaches or surgical interventions. The success of these early therapeutic applications created enormous demand for ADAM-based treatments throughout Rapture's population, while also generating the financial resources necessary to fund expanded research into more ambitious applications of the compound that would eventually transform the entire social and economic structure of the underwater city in ways that neither Ryan nor his associates had anticipated during the initial development phases. The medical applications of ADAM included treatments for spinal cord injuries that could restore mobility to paralyzed patients within days of treatment, regenerative therapies for organ damage that could restore full function to hearts, livers, and kidneys that had been considered beyond repair, and neurological treatments that could reverse the effects of stroke, traumatic brain injury, and degenerative diseases that had previously been considered untreatable. The success rates for these treatments exceeded anything that had been achieved through conventional medicine, creating a revolution in healthcare that made Rapture's medical facilities the most advanced in the world, while also attracting additional residents who sought access to these miraculous treatments. The transformation of ADAM from an experimental laboratory curiosity into a commercial product required the development of sophisticated production and distribution systems that could ensure consistent quality and availability while maintaining the secrecy necessary to protect Rapture's technological advantages from surface world competitors who might seek to steal or duplicate the breakthrough for their own purposes. The infrastructure that emerged to support the ADAM industry became one of the largest and most important economic sectors in Rapture's rapidly evolving economy, employing thousands of workers in various capacities, ranging from specimen collection and processing to product development and consumer services, while generating revenues that supported continued expansion of the city's research capabilities and technological infrastructure beyond what had been possible during the initial construction and settlement phases. Frank Fontaine, whose combination of business acumen, moral flexibility, and willingness to take risks that other entrepreneurs might avoid had already made him one of Rapture's most successful businessmen, recognized the commercial potential of ADAM earlier and more clearly than most other residents, positioning himself to become the dominant force in the emerging genetic enhancement industry through a combination of strategic investments, aggressive marketing campaigns, and innovative product development that appealed to consumers' desires for self-improvement and competitive advantage. Fontaine Futuristics, the company he established to commercialize ADAM-based products, quickly became the most visible and influential enterprise in Rapture's genetic enhancement market, offering consumers a wide range of products that promised to enhance their physical, mental, and aesthetic capabilities in ways that had never been available to any previous human population. The corporate culture that Fontaine established at Fontaine Futuristics reflected his pragmatic approach to business development and his willingness to prioritize profit and market share over ethical considerations or long-term social consequences, creating an organization that was focused entirely on identifying consumer desires and developing products that could satisfy those desires regardless of their potential for abuse or addiction. The research and development departments that Fontaine established were given unlimited budgets and minimal oversight, enabling them to pursue innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible, while also creating products that would generate maximum revenue through repeat sales and customer dependency. The plasmids that emerged as Fontaine Futuristics' flagship products represented a revolutionary approach to genetic enhancement that made the power of ADAM accessible to ordinary consumers through easy-to-use injectable formulations that could grant specific supernatural abilities, with immediate and dramatic effects that transformed users' capabilities and experiences in fundamental ways. The telekinetic plasmids that enabled users to manipulate objects with their minds. The pyrokinetic formulations that allowed the generation and control of fire, and the electrokinetic variants that granted power over electrical energy, represented just the beginning of a product line that would eventually include dozens of different enhancement options catering to every conceivable desire for superhuman capabilities, from enhanced combat abilities to improved social manipulation skills, to expanded sensory perception that could reveal previously hidden aspects of the physical world. The marketing campaigns that promoted these plasmid products emphasized the empowerment and personal transformation that genetic enhancement could provide, appealing to consumers' desires for self-improvement and competitive advantage, while downplaying or ignoring the potential risks and side effects that might accompany their use. The advertising materials that appeared throughout Rapture promised that plasmids could help users achieve their dreams and overcome their limitations, creating a culture of enhancement that made genetic modification seem not just desirable, but necessary for success and happiness in the competitive environment of the underwater city. The gene tonics that complemented the plasmid product line provided permanent genetic modifications that enhanced users' physical and mental characteristics in ways that improved their overall quality of life, while also making them more effective in their professional and personal activities, creating lasting changes that became integral parts of their enhanced biology, rather than temporary effects that required regular renewal through continued product consumption. The strength enhancement tonics that increased physical power and endurance, the intelligence boosters that expanded cognitive capacity and processing speed, and the health improvements that enhanced disease resistance and healing rates represented practical applications of ADAM technology that appealed to consumers who wanted lasting improvements rather than temporary supernatural abilities, while also creating a customer base that would require ongoing products and services to maintain and optimize their enhanced capabilities. The social impact of widespread ADAM use throughout Rapture's population was profound and complex, creating new forms of inequality based on access to genetic enhancement, while also generating unprecedented opportunities for human advancement and achievement that had never been available to any previous society in human history. Citizens who could afford regular ADAM treatments gained significant advantages in physical and intellectual capabilities that translated into professional success and personal satisfaction, while those who lacked the financial resources to participate in the enhancement programs found themselves increasingly disadvantaged in a society where genetic modification was becoming the norm rather than the exception, creating a growing divide between the enhanced elite and the unmodified underclass that challenged Ryan's original vision of meritocratic equality. As the ADAM research program expanded to encompass these new industrial applications, the compound's role in Rapture's society evolved from being primarily a medical and consumer technology to becoming the foundation for an entirely new approach to human-machine integration that would eventually give birth to programs for creating enhanced guardians and protectors whose capabilities would exceed anything that natural human evolution had produced. The sea slugs that had initially seemed like mere scientific curiosities became the biological foundation for a transformation of human nature that would produce some of the most remarkable and disturbing achievements in the history of genetic engineering, setting the stage for developments that would reshape not only individual human beings, but the entire future trajectory of Rapture's civilization and its relationship with the broader world from which it had sought to escape. The paradise that Andrew Ryan had constructed beneath the Atlantic Ocean began to show its first signs of structural weakness, not through engineering failures or external threats, but through the inevitable consequences of the very success that had made his underwater city the most advanced civilization in human history. The widespread adoption of ADAM throughout Rapture's population had created capabilities and opportunities that exceeded anything Ryan had envisioned during his original planning, but these advances came with unforeseen costs that would gradually undermine the philosophical foundations upon which his society had been built, creating tensions and contradictions that would eventually tear apart the community he had worked so hard to protect from the parasitic influences of the surface world. The first manifestation of these emerging problems appeared in the form of what Dr. Tenenbaum and Dr. Suchong initially dismissed as isolated cases of ADAM withdrawal syndrome, affecting individuals who had been regular users of genetic enhancement products, but who had been forced to discontinue their treatments due to financial constraints or supply interruptions. The symptoms that these individuals displayed were far more severe and disturbing than anything that had been predicted based on the preliminary research conducted during ADAM's development phase, suggesting that the compound's effects on human biology were more complex and potentially dangerous than had been understood by the scientists who had brought it to market. The physical manifestations of ADAM withdrawal included severe muscle tremors, skin lesions, and progressive deterioration of motor control that left affected individuals increasingly unable to perform basic daily activities without assistance, while the psychological symptoms involved heightened aggression, paranoid delusions, and an almost overwhelming compulsion to obtain more ADAM regardless of the cost or consequences. The combination of physical incapacity and mental instability created a population of desperate individuals who posed increasing threats to both themselves and the broader community, as their need for genetic enhancement products drove them to increasingly extreme and violent behaviors. The economic implications of widespread ADAM addiction became apparent as growing numbers of Rapture's citizens found themselves unable to afford the continued treatments that their modified biology required to function normally, creating a class of genetic invalids who were neither fully human nor successfully enhanced, but trapped in a liminal state that left them dependent on substances they could not obtain through legitimate means. The black market that emerged to serve these desperate individuals created new opportunities for criminal enterprises, while also generating violence and social instability that threatened the orderly society that Ryan had worked to establish. Dr. Sophia Lamb arrived in Rapture during this period of growing crisis, ostensibly to provide psychological services to residents who were struggling to adapt to life in the isolated underwater environment. But her background in social psychology and her philosophical commitment to collectivist principles made her a natural advocate for those members of the community who had been left behind by the genetic enhancement revolution. Lamb's academic credentials and her apparent genuine concern for the welfare of Rapture's most vulnerable residents earned her respect and influence that would eventually position her as the most significant intellectual challenge to Ryan's individualistic philosophy. The therapeutic approach that Lamb developed for treating ADAM-related psychological disorders was based on her belief that the root cause of these problems lay not in the compound itself, but in the social system that had made genetic enhancement a luxury available only to those with sufficient wealth to afford it, creating artificial scarcities and inequalities that drove individuals to desperate measures in their pursuit of biological improvement. Her treatment programs emphasized community support and collective responsibility for individual welfare, directly challenging the radical individualism that formed the cornerstone of Ryan's social philosophy. The public debates that began to occur between Ryan and Lamb represented far more than academic disagreements about social policy. They were fundamental confrontations between competing visions of human nature and social organization that exposed the contradictions and weaknesses in Ryan's original conception of his underwater utopia. Lamb's articulate advocacy for altruistic principles and collective responsibility provided a coherent alternative to Ryan's individualistic ideology, attracting support from residents who had been excluded from or harmed by the genetic enhancement economy that had come to dominate Rapture's social and economic life. The philosophical content of these debates revealed the depth of the ideological divide that was emerging within Rapture's intellectual community, as Lamb argued that true human progress required cooperation and mutual support, rather than competition and individual achievement, while Ryan maintained that any form of collective action inevitably led to parasitic exploitation of productive individuals by those who had contributed nothing to society's advancement. The audiences that attended these public discussions found themselves forced to choose between two fundamentally incompatible worldviews that offered different explanations for the problems that were increasingly plaguing their community. The religious dimensions of the conflict between Ryan and Lamb became apparent when she challenged his prohibition on organized religious activity within Rapture, arguing that spiritual needs were as fundamental as material needs, and that a truly free society should accommodate all forms of human expression and belief. Ryan's response revealed the authoritarian tendencies that were beginning to emerge from his commitment to atheistic materialism, as he insisted that religious institutions represented forms of mental parasitism that weakened individual rational capacity and created opportunities for manipulation by charismatic leaders who claimed divine authority for their earthly ambitions. The smuggling operation that Frank Fontaine had been conducting throughout this period had been providing religious materials and other contraband from the surface world to Rapture residents who were willing to pay premium prices for access to forbidden goods and services that were not available through legitimate channels within the city. The religious items that Fontaine smuggled into Rapture included Bibles, prayer books, crucifixes, and other artifacts that satisfied the spiritual needs of residents who had not fully embraced Ryan's materialistic philosophy, while also generating substantial profits for the criminal network that had developed around these illegal activities. The discovery of Fontaine's smuggling operation by Ryan's security forces represented a major crisis for the stability of Rapture's social order, as it revealed the extent to which residents were willing to violate the fundamental rule that prohibited contact with the surface world in order to obtain goods and services that met their personal needs and desires. The investigation that Ryan ordered into the smuggling network revealed a complex web of relationships that involved not only criminal elements, but also respected members of the community who had been driven to illegal activities by the Phocians. Restrictions and limitations that characterized life in the Purse, isolated underwater city. The evidence that emerged from this investigation demonstrated that Fontaine had been using his legitimate business operations as cover for extensive criminal activities that included not only smuggling but also money laundering, illegal weapons trafficking, and the operation of underground gambling establishments that catered to residents seeking forms of entertainment that were not available through approved channels. The scope and sophistication of these illegal operations suggested that Fontaine had been building a parallel economy within Rapture that competed directly with Ryan's vision of lawful commercial activity based on voluntary exchange and legitimate business practices. The social conditions that had made Fontaine's criminal enterprises profitable reflected the growing inequality and social stratification that had emerged within Rapture as a result of the genetic enhancement economy and the growing concentration of wealth and power among those who had been most successful in exploiting the commercial opportunities created by ADAM technology. The residents who participated in illegal activities were often those who had been excluded from the legitimate economy or who had found themselves unable to compete effectively in a society where genetic enhancement provided significant advantages in both professional and personal contexts. Fontaine's Home for the Poor, which ostensibly served as a charitable institution providing housing and support services for Rapture's most disadvantaged residents, actually functioned as a recruitment center for criminal activities and a base of operations for organizing political opposition to Ryan's increasingly authoritarian governance. The individuals who sought assistance from this institution were often those who had been most severely affected by ADAM addiction, or who had been unable to afford the genetic enhancements that had become necessary for economic success in Rapture's competitive environment. The political organization that Fontaine built through his charitable activities was based on appeals to class resentment and promises of economic redistribution that directly challenged Ryan's free market philosophy, offering an alternative vision of social organization that emphasized collective ownership and shared responsibility for community welfare. The meetings that were conducted at the Home for the Poor increasingly resembled political rallies, where residents who felt excluded from Rapture's prosperity could voice their grievances and plan collective action to address their concerns through means that went beyond the individual. Initiative that Ryan's philosophy prescribed as the solution to all social problems. The intelligence network that Ryan established to monitor these activities revealed the extent to which his original vision of a harmonious community of exceptional individuals had been replaced by a society divided between those who had benefited from genetic enhancement and technological progress, and those who had been left behind by these developments. The surveillance reports that his security forces produced documented growing levels of social tension and political dissatisfaction that threatened the stability of the entire community, while also revealing the sophistication of the opposition movements that were organizing to challenge his authority. Ryan's response to these emerging threats involved a gradual abandonment of the libertarian principles that had originally guided his governance of Rapture, as he began to implement increasingly authoritarian measures designed to suppress dissent and maintain control over a population that was becoming more restive and difficult to manage through purely voluntary means. The security forces that he expanded during this period were given broader powers to conduct surveillance and detention operations, while new regulations were established that restricted freedom of movement and association in ways that contradicted his original commitment to individual liberty. The imprisonment of Sophia Lamb represented Ryan's first major violation of his own philosophical principles, as he used his political authority to silence a critic whose ideas challenged his worldview rather than engaging with her arguments through rational debate and voluntary persuasion. The charges that were brought against Lamb were based on her alleged promotion of collectivist ideology that threatened the social order. But the real reason for her detention was Ryan's recognition that her influence was growing among residents who were dissatisfied with the results of his individualistic policies. The legal proceedings that resulted in Lamb's imprisonment were conducted through the minimal governmental structure that Ryan had established for Rapture, but they represented a fundamental expansion of state power beyond the limited functions that had been originally envisioned for the community's political institutions. The precedent that was established through Lamb's case would eventually justify much more extensive violations of individual rights as Ryan's paranoia and authoritarianism continued to grow in response to the mounting challenges to his authority and his vision for the underwater city. The economic warfare that Ryan began to wage against his opponents involved the use of his control over essential services and infrastructure to punish individuals and organizations that were perceived as threats to his authority, demonstrating how the monopolistic position that Ryan Industries had achieved in key sectors of Rapture's economy could be used as a weapon against political dissent. The residents who were identified as supporters of Lamb or Fontaine found themselves facing difficulties in obtaining housing, employment, and access to services that made life in Rapture increasingly uncomfortable and eventually unsustainable. The psychological transformation that Ryan underwent during this period reflected the corrupting influence of absolute power and the gradual erosion of his commitment to the principles that had originally motivated his creation of Rapture. As a refuge from the authoritarian governments and parasitic political systems that he had sought to escape, the man who had once condemned the Bolsheviks for using political authority to suppress individual achievement was now employing similar tactics to maintain his own position and protect his own vision from criticism and challenge. The irony of Ryan's evolution from libertarian visionary to authoritarian ruler was apparent to many observers within Rapture, but the concentration of power in his hands and the fear that his security apparatus inspired made open criticism increasingly dangerous and rare. The residents who had originally been attracted to Rapture by promises of individual freedom and voluntary association found themselves living under a regime that was becoming as oppressive and arbitrary as the surface governments they had sought to escape, creating disillusionment and resentment that would eventually contribute to the violent conflicts that would tear the community apart. The discovery of Fontaine's treasonous activities provided Ryan with the justification he needed to implement even more draconian measures against those who were perceived as threats to Rapture's security and stability, as the evidence of contact with the surface world violated the fundamental rule upon which the community's existence was based. The investigation that followed revealed the extensive nature of Fontaine's criminal network and the degree to which it had penetrated legitimate institutions and corrupted individuals who had appeared to be loyal citizens of the criminal network. Underwater City. The manhunt that was launched to capture Fontaine and his associates involved the mobilization of all of Rapture's security resources and the implementation of emergency measures that effectively placed the entire city under martial law, suspending many of the individual rights and freedoms that had been promised to residents when they agreed to join Ryan's experimental community. The atmosphere of suspicion and fear that developed during this period transformed Rapture from a voluntary association of like-minded individuals into a police state where surveillance and informing became necessary for survival. The social fabric of Rapture was further damaged by the revelation that many respected members of the community had been involved in, or had knowledge of illegal activities that violated the trust and cooperation that had been essential for the community's successful operation during its early years. The friendships and professional relationships that had developed among residents were poisoned by suspicion and fear, as individuals began to question the loyalty and reliability of those around them, while also worrying about their own potential exposure to prosecution for activities that had previously been considered harmless or necessary. The economic disruption that resulted from the crackdown on illegal activities created shortages and supply problems that affected all residents of Rapture, as the underground economy that Fontaine had established had been providing goods and services that were not available through legitimate channels but that had become essential for many residents' quality of life and professional activities. The elimination of these illegal sources of supply created hardships and inconveniences that generated additional resentment against Ryan's increasingly restrictive policies, while also demonstrating the extent to which the community had become dependent on activities that violated its founding principles. As the crisis deepened and Ryan's responses became more authoritarian and destructive, the paradise that had been created beneath the Atlantic Ocean began to resemble the oppressive societies that its founder had sought to escape, while the residents who had trusted in his vision found themselves trapped in a system that had betrayed the promises that had brought them to this isolated sanctuary. The contradictions and failures that were becoming apparent in Ryan's philosophy and governance created opportunities for those who sought to challenge his authority, setting the stage for the violent conflicts that would eventually destroy the remarkable civilization that had been built in the depths of the ocean through the dreams and efforts of individuals who had believed that human beings could create something better than the corrupted societies of the surface world. The intimate relationship that would ultimately prove to be Andrew Ryan's greatest vulnerability began on an evening in the spring of 1957, when the mounting pressures of governing Rapture and the growing challenges posed by ADAM addiction and political opposition drove him to seek solace in the entertainment districts that had flourished in the lower levels of his underwater city. The loneliness that had accompanied Ryan's position as Rapture's supreme authority had become increasingly difficult to bear, as his paranoia about potential threats and his growing distrust of those around him had isolated him from the genuine human connections that might have provided comfort and perspective during these troubled times. Eve's Garden, the most exclusive and sophisticated entertainment establishment in Rapture, catered to the city's elite with a combination of artistic performances, fine dining, and companionship services that reflected the technological and cultural sophistication that characterized the underwater metropolis during its golden years. The establishment's reputation for discretion and quality had made it a favorite gathering place for Rapture's most successful residents, while its carefully cultivated atmosphere of elegance and refinement provided an environment where powerful individuals could relax and enjoy themselves without the constant vigilance that their public roles required. The architectural design of Eve's Garden embodied the Art Deco aesthetic that characterized all of Rapture's finest establishments, featuring soaring ceilings decorated with intricate geometric patterns, elegant lighting fixtures that cast warm and inviting illumination throughout the space, and luxurious furnishings that demonstrated the highest standards of craftsmanship and material quality. The venue's multiple levels and intimate alcoves provided opportunities for private conversation and personal connection, while the main performance areas showcased artistic presentations that rivaled anything available in the surface world's most prestigious cultural centers. The young woman who caught Ryan's attention during that fateful visit was Jasmine Jolene, an exotic dancer whose combination of physical beauty, artistic talent, and apparent intelligence made her one of Eve's Garden's most popular and successful performers. Jasmine's background as an aspiring actress who had come to Rapture, seeking opportunities that were not available in the surface world's entertainment industry, reflected the dreams and ambitions that had motivated many of the Pressed City's residents to abandon their previous lives in pursuit of greater freedom and achievement in Ryan's underwater paradise. The performance that Jasmine delivered on the night of their first encounter demonstrated not only her physical grace and artistic ability, but also her sophisticated understanding of the psychological and emotional needs of her audience, as she possessed an intuitive ability to connect with individuals who sought not merely entertainment but genuine human contact and emotional understanding. Her repertoire included classical dance techniques that she had studied at prestigious academies, combined with more contemporary forms of expression that reflected the cultural innovation and artistic freedom that characterized Rapture's creative community. The conversation that developed between Ryan and Jasmine after her performance revealed depths of intelligence and cultural sophistication that distinguished her from the typical entertainers who worked in such establishments, as she demonstrated knowledge of literature, philosophy, and politics that enabled her to engage meaningfully with Ryan's intellectual interests and personal concerns. Her apparent genuine curiosity about his thoughts on governance, human nature, and the challenges of creating a perfect society provided him with the kind of stimulating dialogue that had become increasingly rare in his interactions with other residents of the city. The evening that Ryan spent with Jasmine represented one of the few occasions during this period when he was able to temporarily set aside the burdens of leadership and experience something approaching normal human intimacy, as her apparent genuine interest in his thoughts and feelings provided a respite from the calculated interactions that characterized most of his relationships with other residents of the city. The conversation that developed between them during their time together revealed Ryan's deep loneliness and his growing uncertainty about whether the vision he had pursued so relentlessly was actually achievable in the face of human nature's apparent tendency toward conflict and parasitism. But the personal connection that Ryan felt during this encounter was built upon a foundation of deception and manipulation that he could not have detected, as Jasmine's apparent interest in him was motivated not by genuine affection, but by the financial arrangements that Frank Fontaine had made with her as part of his long-term strategy to compromise and ultimately destroy Ryan's authority. The intimacy that Ryan experienced as authentic human connection was actually a carefully orchestrated performance, designed to extract information and create opportunities for exploitation that would serve Fontaine's criminal and political ambitions. The recruitment process through which Fontaine had originally identified and cultivated Jasmine as an asset had begun months before her encounter with Ryan, as his criminal organization had systematically surveyed the entertainment industry in Rapture to identify individuals who possessed both the physical and intellectual qualities necessary to attract and maintain the attention of the city's most powerful residents. The selection criteria that Fontaine's agents had employed emphasized not only conventional attractiveness, but also intelligence, emotional stability, and the kind of personal desperation that would make individuals willing to participate in schemes that violated their moral principles in exchange for financial security and access to the ADAM treatments that their modified biology required. The training program that Jasmine had undergone in preparation for her assignment had included instruction in psychology, sociology, and political theory that enabled her to engage knowledgeably with Ryan's intellectual interests, while also providing her with techniques for emotional manipulation and information extraction that had been developed through Fontaine's extensive experience with criminal enterprises. The coaching that she received emphasized the importance of appearing genuine and spontaneous, while actually following carefully planned scripts and procedures designed to achieve specific objectives related to intelligence gathering, relationship building. The pregnancy that resulted from Ryan's encounter with Jasmine created an opportunity that Fontaine had not specifically planned for, but that he immediately recognized as potentially more valuable than any of the intelligence or blackmail possibilities that had originally motivated his investment in establishing a relationship between Ryan and one of his agents. The genetic material that the unborn child carried represented the key to bypassing the security systems that Ryan had installed throughout Rapture to prevent unauthorized access to critical infrastructure and sensitive areas, as these systems were designed to respond exclusively to Ryan's unique genetic signature. The security architecture that protected Rapture from internal threats was based on the assumption that Ryan himself could never become a threat to the city's stability, and therefore, his genetic patterns served as the ultimate override mechanism that could access any system and override any restriction that had been established to protect the community from sabotage or unauthorized interference. The biometric scanners and genetic locks that secured everything from administrative computers to emergency systems to the city's most sensitive research facilities could be bypassed only by someone who shared Ryan's genetic characteristics, making any blood relative a potential security vulnerability of enormous proportions. The technological sophistication of these genetic security systems reflected the advanced scientific capabilities that Rapture's researchers had developed during the city's years of technological progress, incorporating DNA analysis techniques that were decades ahead of surface world capabilities, while also utilizing quantum encryption and biological programming that made conventional attempts at circumvention virtually impossible. The integration of these security measures with the city's essential systems meant that Ryan's genetic signature was required not only for accessing sensitive information, but also for controlling power generation, atmospheric processing, and emergency protocols that were essential for the survival of all residents. The negotiation between Fontaine and Jasmine over the sale of her unborn child reflected the brutal pragmatism that characterized both parties to this transaction, as the desperate financial circumstances that had made Jasmine vulnerable to Fontaine's initial recruitment now made her willing to participate in a scheme that violated every principle of maternal love and human decency. The poverty that she experienced as a result of her addiction to Adam and her inability to afford the continued treatments that her modified biology required had left her with few options for survival, while the substantial payment that Fontaine offered represented the only realistic possibility for securing the genetic enhancement products she needed to maintain her health and sanity. The legal documentation that formalized this arrangement was carefully crafted to appear as a standard adoption agreement, while actually transferring complete custody and control of the child to Fontaine's organization, eliminating any potential claims that Jasmine might later make for parental rights or custody arrangements. The contract also included confidentiality provisions that prohibited her from discussing the transaction or revealing any information about the child's biological father, backed by penalty clauses that would result in severe financial and physical consequences for violations of these secrecy requirements. The scientific and technical challenges involved in accelerating the development of the unborn child required the expertise of Dr. Yi-Su Chong, whose research into human genetic modification and developmental biology had provided him with the knowledge and capabilities necessary to manipulate human growth processes in ways that had never been attempted before. The procedures that Suchong developed for this project pushed the boundaries of existing science while also creating new possibilities for controlling and directing human development that would have applications far beyond the immediate requirements of Fontaine's assassination plot. Project Jack, as the initiative came to be known within Fontaine's organization, represented the convergence of advanced genetic modification techniques, psychological conditioning protocols, and strategic planning that demonstrated the sophistication and ruthlessness of the criminal empire that Fontaine had built within the heart of Ryan's supposedly perfect society. The child who would emerge from this project would be simultaneously Ryan's biological son and his most dangerous enemy, combining the genetic access codes that could bypass Rapture's security systems with the psychological programming that would make him an unwitting weapon in the hands of those who sought to destroy his father and claim control of the Phazin underwater city. The growth acceleration process that transformed the developing fetus into a physically mature individual within months rather than years involved the application of ADAM-based modifications that altered the fundamental biological processes governing cellular development and tissue formation. The techniques that Souchong employed drew upon his research into the compound's regenerative properties and its ability to reprogram genetic expression, enabling him to speed up the natural maturation process, while also ensuring that the subject would possess the physical capabilities necessary to carry out the complex mission that Fontaine had planned for him. The laboratory facilities where this unprecedented experiment was conducted were located in the most secure sections of Fontaine's industrial complex, hidden beneath legitimate research operations and protected by multiple layers of security that prevented unauthorized access, while also concealing the true nature of the work being performed from government inspectors and rival organizations. The equipment that was required for this project included advanced medical technology, genetic sequencing devices, and biological manipulation apparatus that represented the cutting edge of Rapture's scientific capabilities. The psychological conditioning that accompanied the physical development process was designed to create a personality structure that would be completely malleable to external control, while also maintaining sufficient intelligence and initiative to function effectively in complex social situations. The techniques that were used to achieve this psychological malleability drew upon research into hypnosis, behavioral modification, and neurochemical manipulation that enabled the programmers to implant specific behavioral triggers and response patterns, while suppressing the subject's capacity for independent critical thinking about his fundamental beliefs and motivations. The neurological modifications that were required to implement this psychological programming involved surgical interventions that altered brain structure and chemistry in ways that would make the subject responsive to specific verbal commands while maintaining normal cognitive function in all other areas. The precision required for these procedures demanded the development of new surgical techniques and monitoring equipment that could track neural activity in real time, while ensuring that the modifications achieved their intended effects without causing detectable damage to the subject's mental capabilities. The trigger phrase, "Would you kindly," was selected as the primary mechanism for controlling Jack's behavior because its apparent politeness and casual nature would make it unlikely to attract attention from observers, while also providing a reliable means of compelling obedience to any command that followed its utterance. The neurological modifications that made this trigger phrase effective involved alterations to the brain structures responsible for volition and decision-making, creating pathways that bypassed conscious analysis and generated automatic compliance with instructions delivered through the appropriate verbal formula. The testing procedures that validated the effectiveness of this conditioning involved extensive trials with various command structures and behavioral scenarios that confirmed the subject's responsiveness to the trigger phrase, while also identifying potential limitations or failure modes that might compromise the system's reliability during actual deployment. The data that was collected during these tests provided insights into human psychology and neural programming that had applications far beyond the immediate requirements of the assassination project. The secondary trigger phrase, Code Yellow, was implanted as an emergency termination mechanism that would cause Jack's death if the assassination mission went wrong, or if he showed signs of breaking free from his psychological conditioning, ensuring that he could not be captured and interrogated about the conspiracy that had created him. The biological modifications that made this kill switch possible involved alterations to Jack's cardiovascular system that would cause immediate cardiac arrest upon activation, providing Fontaine with a means of eliminating evidence and preventing exposure of his role in the plot against Ryan. The false memories that were implanted to provide Jack with a complete personal history were carefully constructed to create a believable background that would withstand casual scrutiny, while also providing psychological stability for an individual who had no authentic experiences upon which to base his sense of identity. The fictional life story that was created for Jack included childhood experiences, educational background, family relationships, and personal interests that would enable him to function convincingly as a normal surface world resident, while also providing emotional foundations that would support his psychological stability during the stressful mission he would be required to undertake. The memory implantation process required multiple sessions of psychological programming, during which artificial experiences were layered into Jack's consciousness through a combination of hypnosis, drug therapy, and direct neural stimulation that created the subjective sensation of genuine recollection. The complexity of these artificial memories demanded careful attention to consistency and detail, as any contradictions or implausible elements might trigger conscious questioning that could compromise the entire conditioning system. The surface world identity that was created for Jack included documentation, financial accounts, and social connections that would establish his legitimacy as an American citizen, with no apparent connection to Rapture or any of its residents, while also positioning him to be brought to the underwater city through circumstances that would appear completely coincidental and beyond the control of any human agency. The elaborate deception that surrounded Jack's insertion into the surface world required the cooperation of Fontaine's criminal network and represented one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations ever conducted by any organization. The years that Jack spent living in the surface world while awaiting activation represented a period of careful monitoring and subtle manipulation, designed to ensure that his psychological conditioning remained intact while also providing him with the experiences and skills that would be necessary for his eventual mission. The handlers who supervised his development during this period maintained contact through means that appeared completely innocent and normal, while also conducting regular assessments to verify that the trigger phrases remained effective and that his implanted memories were not being compromised by genuine experiences or relationships. The discovery of Jasmine's pregnancy by Ryan's intelligence network represented a crisis that revealed both the extent of Fontaine's penetration of Rapture's elite social circles and the personal vulnerability that Ryan's loneliness had created in his otherwise impregnable position. The investigation that Ryan ordered into Jasmine's background and activities uncovered evidence of her connection to Fontaine's criminal organization, while also revealing the extent to which his personal life had been compromised by enemies who were willing to exploit his human needs for companionship and intimacy. The confrontation between Ryan and Jasmine, when he learned of her betrayal, represented one of the few occasions when the underwater city's supreme leader allowed his emotions to override his calculated approach to problem-solving, as the combination of personal betrayal and strategic vulnerability created a rage that overwhelmed his normally controlled demeanor. The revelation that she had sold their unborn child to his greatest enemy violated not only his trust, but his fundamental beliefs about human nature and the possibility of genuine relationships in a world where everyone seemed to be motivated by parasitic self-interest rather than authentic connection. The murder of Jasmine Jolene marked Ryan's first act of direct personal violence and represented a crucial step in his transformation from visionary leader to tyrannical ruler, as the killing demonstrated his willingness to use extreme measures to protect his authority and punish those who threatened his vision for Rapture. The brutality of this crime reflected the depth of his rage and betrayal, while also establishing a precedent for the increasingly violent methods that he would employ to maintain control over his deteriorating paradise. As Jack continued his carefully orchestrated life in the surface world, waiting for the signal that would activate his programming and bring him home to fulfill his terrible purpose, Ryan remained unaware of the specific timeline and methodology that would govern the assassination plot, knowing only that somewhere beyond the protective walls of his underwater paradise, forces were gathering that would eventually destroy everything he had worked to create, while also targeting the most personal and vulnerable aspects of his identity as both a leader and a father. The elaborate theatrical performance that would transform Frank Fontaine from hunted criminal into revolutionary hero began in the abandoned industrial districts of Rapture, where the decay and neglect that had followed the city's golden years provided perfect cover for staging one of the most audacious deceptions in the history of political manipulation. The plan that Fontaine had developed to fake his own death required not only careful coordination of multiple criminal associates, but also an understanding of human psychology and media manipulation that demonstrated his genius for exploiting the weaknesses and assumptions that governed how people interpreted evidence and constructed their understanding of reality. The location selected for Fontaine's apparent demise was a derelict warehouse complex in Neptune's Bounty, an area that had once housed thriving fishing and processing operations, but had been largely abandoned as Rapture's economy shifted toward more sophisticated industries and ADAM-based enterprises. The deteriorating buildings and flooded corridors of this district provided an appropriately dramatic setting for a violent confrontation, while the maze-like layout of interconnected structures offered multiple escape routes and hiding places that could facilitate the complex choreography required to create a convincing simulation of death while ensuring the survival of the supposedly deceased individual. The architectural features of the warehouse complex had been carefully studied by Fontaine's associates during months of reconnaissance, as they mapped every corridor, ventilation shaft, and underwater access point that could be used during the operation. The structural damage that had accumulated over years of neglect created natural hiding places and observation points, while the partially flooded lower levels provided opportunities for underwater escape that would be invisible to surface observers. The electrical systems that had once powered the facility's operations had been strategically modified to create impressive pyrotechnic effects when overloaded, while the industrial machinery that remained in place could be rigged to explode with spectacular results that would enhance the credibility of the staged confrontation. The criminal network that Fontaine had assembled over years of illegal operations provided him with the human resources necessary to execute this deception, as his associates possessed the technical skills, local knowledge, and moral flexibility required to participate in a scheme that involved extensive violence, property destruction, and systematic deception of law enforcement authorities. The men who agreed to participate in this operation understood that their own survival depended on its success, as Ryan's increasingly authoritarian crackdown on criminal activity had made it impossible for any of them to continue their illegal enterprises without eventually being captured and executed for treason against the state. The recruitment process for this operation had emphasized loyalty and competence over conventional moral considerations, as Fontaine selected individuals whose criminal backgrounds and personal circumstances made them willing to risk their lives in exchange for the financial rewards and protection that successful completion of the mission would provide. The team that he assembled included demolitions experts who could create convincing explosions, medical professionals who could prepare realistic biological evidence, communications specialists who could coordinate the complex timing required for the deception, and combat veterans who could engage Ryan's security forces with sufficient skill to make the confrontation appear genuine while avoiding unnecessary casualties among their own ranks. The preparation phase for the staged death involved weeks of careful planning and rehearsal, as every aspect of the operation had to be precisely coordinated to create the appearance of genuine violence while avoiding actual casualties among Fontaine's associates and ensuring that all physical evidence would support the Pace's blend's narrative of his death rather than revealing the deception. The weapons that would be used in the staged confrontation were carefully selected and modified to produce impressive visual and auditory effects without causing fatal injuries, while the explosive devices that would be detonated during the final phase of the operation were positioned to create maximum destruction and confusion while providing cover for Fontaine's escape. The biological materials that would serve as evidence of Fontaine's death were obtained through a network of corrupt medical personnel who had access to morgues, hospitals, and research facilities throughout Rapture, providing blood samples, tissue specimens, and body parts that could be distributed throughout the warehouse complex to create convincing proof of violent death. The DNA profiles and genetic markers that would be discovered by forensic investigators were carefully matched to Fontaine's known characteristics, while the quantity and distribution of biological evidence were calculated to suggest the kind of catastrophic bodily destruction that would be consistent with the explosive finale that had been planned for the operation. The intelligence network that Fontaine had cultivated within Ryan's security forces provided him with detailed information about the timing and methodology of the raid that was planned to capture him, enabling him to position his associates and prepare his escape route, while also ensuring that the confrontation would occur under circumstances that would maximize the credibility of his apparent death. The corrupt officials who provided this information understood that their own positions would be compromised if Fontaine were captured alive and forced to reveal the extent of his criminal network, making them eager collaborators in the deception that would eliminate the threat to their continued survival and prosperity. The financial arrangements that secured the cooperation of these corrupt officials involved not only immediate cash payments, but also long-term insurance policies that would provide continued income and protection for their families in the event that their participation in the deception was eventually discovered. The Swiss bank accounts and offshore investment funds that Fontaine had established during his years of criminal activity provided the resources necessary to fund these arrangements, while also creating financial incentives for continued loyalty and silence that would persist long after the immediate operation was completed. The night of the staged confrontation began with carefully orchestrated intelligence leaks that led Ryan's forces to the warehouse complex, where Fontaine and his associates had prepared their elaborate performance, timing the arrival of law enforcement personnel to coincide with the peak dramatic moment when the deception would be most convincing. The initial exchange of gunfire between Fontaine's men and Ryan's security forces was genuine enough to create authentic casualties and property damage, establishing the credibility of the confrontation, while also providing cover for the more theatrical elements that would follow. The psychological preparation that Fontaine's associates had undergone for this operation included training in acting techniques, and emotional manipulation that enabled them to project genuine fear, anger, and desperation during the confrontation, creating the kind of authentic human drama that would convince observers that they were witnessing a real life and death struggle, rather than a carefully choreographed performance. The improvised dialogue and spontaneous actions that occurred during the staged battle were guided by general scenarios and objectives rather than specific scripts, allowing for the kind of natural variation and unpredictability that would enhance the credibility of the deception. The explosions that marked the climax of the staged confrontation were carefully timed to create maximum visual impact, while also destroying evidence that might have revealed the deceptive nature of the operation, as the flames and smoke that engulfed the warehouse complex provided both spectacular confirmation of Fontaine's apparent death and effective concealment of his actual escape through pre-positioned tunnels and underwater passages. The body parts and blood evidence that were discovered in the aftermath of the explosion had been carefully prepared in advance using materials obtained from Rapture's medical facilities and morgues, creating physical proof of death that would satisfy forensic investigators who lacked the time and resources necessary for detailed analysis. The escape route that Fontaine used to disappear from the warehouse complex had been prepared months in advance, involving underwater passages that connected to the city's storm drainage system and abandoned construction sites that provided temporary shelter while his transformation into Atlas was completed. The diving equipment and life support systems that enabled him to navigate these flooded tunnels had been cached at strategic locations, while safe houses equipped with medical facilities and disguise materials had been established throughout the city's forgotten districts to support his metamorphosis from criminal mastermind to populist revolutionary. The immediate aftermath of Fontaine's supposed death created exactly the kind of celebration and relief among Ryan's supporters that had been anticipated, as the elimination of Rapture's most notorious criminal leader appeared to validate the effectiveness of the increasingly authoritarian measures that had been implemented to restore order and security to the underwater city. The news reports that covered the successful raid emphasized the decisive nature of Ryan's victory over criminal elements, while also reinforcing the narrative that violent confrontation was the only effective method for dealing with those who refused to accept the legitimate authority of Rapture's government. The media coverage of the warehouse battle was carefully managed by Ryan's propaganda apparatus, which emphasized the heroic actions of security forces, while downplaying the casualties and collateral damage that had resulted from the confrontation. The photographs and video footage that were released to the public had been edited to remove evidence that might have contradicted the official narrative, while the testimonies of witnesses had been carefully screened to ensure that only supportive accounts were included in news reports. The journalists who covered the story were provided with prepared statements and background information that shaped their reporting in ways that supported Ryan's political objectives. But even as Ryan and his associates celebrated what they believed to be a decisive victory over their most dangerous opponent, Fontaine was already beginning the physical and psychological transformation that would enable him to emerge from hiding as a completely different person whose background and motivations would make him an even more dangerous threat to Ryan's continued authority. The months that Fontaine spent in hiding provided him with the opportunity to study the social and economic conditions that had created widespread dissatisfaction among Rapture's working-class population, while also enabling him to develop the persona and political philosophy that would make his new identity compelling to those who had been excluded from the prosperity that genetic enhancement had brought to the city's elite. The physical transformation that Fontaine underwent during his months in hiding involved not only cosmetic surgery and dental work that altered his facial features and general appearance, but also voice training and physical therapy that changed his posture, gait, and mannerisms in ways that would make him unrecognizable to those who had known him in his previous identity. The medical procedures that were performed to achieve this transformation required the services of skilled surgeons and specialists who had been recruited through bribes and blackmail, while the recovery process demanded months of careful attention to healing and rehabilitation that tested Fontaine's patience and determination. The creation of the Atlas persona required extensive research into the cultural background and linguistic patterns of Irish working-class immigrants, as Fontaine recognized that this demographic represented the most likely source of authentic revolutionary sentiment within Rapture's increasingly stratified population. The accent and mannerisms that he adopted for his new identity were carefully studied and practiced until they became natural and automatic, while the personal history that he created for Atlas included experiences of poverty, discrimination, and exploitation that would resonate with residents who had similar backgrounds and grievances against the existing social order. The voice coaching that Fontaine received to perfect his Irish accent involved months of intensive training with linguists and dialect experts who had been recruited from Rapture's academic and entertainment communities, while the cultural education that accompanied this linguistic transformation included detailed study of Irish history, literature, music, and social customs that would enable Atlas to speak knowledgeably about his supposed background and heritage. The psychological preparation for adopting this new identity involved meditation and visualization techniques that helped Fontaine internalize the emotional and intellectual characteristics that would make Atlas a convincing and charismatic personality. The political philosophy that Atlas would espouse was carefully crafted to appeal to the economic insecurities and social resentments that had been generated by Rapture's transformation from a meritocratic society into a genetic aristocracy where access to enhancement determined individual success and social position. The populist rhetoric that Atlas employed emphasized themes of economic justice, collective solidarity, and resistance to exploitation that directly challenged Ryan's individualistic ideology, while offering an alternative vision of social organization that promised to address the grievances of those who had been left behind by technological progress. The theoretical framework that supported Atlas's revolutionary message drew upon socialist and anarchist political traditions that had been suppressed in surface world societies, but that retained emotional and intellectual appeal for individuals who had experienced economic hardship and social marginalization. The speeches and manifestos that Atlas would deliver combined sophisticated political analysis with emotional appeals that spoke to the personal experiences of his audience, while the practical programs that he proposed offered concrete solutions to the problems that affected the daily lives of Rapture's working-class population. The family that Atlas claimed to have left behind in the surface world served multiple purposes in establishing his credibility and emotional authenticity, as the supposed existence of a wife named Moira and a son named Patrick provided him with personal motivations for his revolutionary activities, while also creating emotional connections with residents who had their own families to protect. The photographs and personal documents that supported this fictional family history were carefully forged using the resources of Fontaine's criminal network, while the detailed stories that Atlas could tell about his loved ones were memorized and practiced until they could be recited with genuine emotional conviction. The backstory that was created for Atlas's fictional family included tragic elements that would generate sympathy and support from his audience, as the supposed death of his wife and the disappearance of his son provided powerful motivations for his opposition to Ryan's government, while also explaining his willingness to risk his life in pursuit of revolutionary change. The emotional manipulation that these fictional tragedies enabled was enhanced by Atlas's apparent genuine grief and anger when discussing his losses, demonstrating the acting abilities and psychological sophistication that made his deception so effective. The underground network that Atlas began to assemble during his months in hiding drew upon the criminal infrastructure that Fontaine had previously established, but expanded it to include political organizers, labor activists, and ideological sympathizers who were motivated by genuine beliefs about social justice rather than merely criminal profit. The meetings that were conducted in abandoned sections of Rapture brought together individuals from diverse backgrounds who shared common grievances against Ryan's increasingly authoritarian government and the economic inequalities that had emerged from the genetic enhancement industry. The recruitment strategies that Atlas employed emphasized personal relationships and emotional connections, rather than abstract political arguments, as he understood that people were more likely to commit to revolutionary activities when they felt personally valued and understood by their leaders. The time that he spent listening to individual stories of hardship and injustice enabled him to develop a comprehensive understanding of the specific grievances that motivated different segments of Rapture's disaffected population, while also providing him with the detailed knowledge of personal circumstances that would enable him to manipulate these individuals effectively when the time came for violent action. Meanwhile, Ryan's response to what he believed was the successful elimination of Fontaine involved a series of policy decisions that would ultimately prove far more damaging to his authority and legitimacy than anything his deceased enemy had accomplished during his lifetime. The nationalization of Fontaine Futuristics represented a fundamental violation of the free market principles that had supposedly distinguished Rapture from the collectivist societies of the surface world, as Ryan used government power to seize private property and redistribute it according to political rather than economic criteria. The legal justifications that Ryan's lawyers developed to support this seizure of private property relied on emergency powers and public safety arguments that had no basis in Rapture's original constitution or legal framework, establishing precedents for government intervention in the economy that contradicted everything that Ryan had previously claimed to believe about individual rights and voluntary exchange. The transformation of a private corporation into a government-owned enterprise demonstrated that Ryan's commitment to free market capitalism was subordinate to his desire to maintain political control, revealing the authoritarian tendencies that had been growing stronger as his paranoia and insecurity increased. The scientific research that Dr. Yi-Su Chong conducted under Ryan's direction during this period focused on developing new methods for controlling human behavior through chemical and psychological manipulation, representing a complete abandonment of the voluntary cooperation that had supposedly characterized Rapture's social organization in favor of biological compulsion that eliminated individual choice entirely. The pheromone control systems that emerged from this research program enabled the government to override citizens' free will through atmospheric contamination, creating a population of biological slaves who would obey government commands regardless of their personal beliefs or interests. As 1959 began with Atlas preparing for the violent revolution that would bring down Ryan's government, and Ryan himself implementing increasingly desperate measures to maintain control over his deteriorating paradise, the stage was set for a civil war that would destroy everything that had been achieved during Rapture's golden years while validating the darkest predictions about human nature and political power that both men had claimed to reject when they first arrived in the underwater city that had promised to transcend the limitations and corruptions of surface world civilization. The last evening of hope in Andrew Ryan's underwater paradise arrived with the elegance and grandeur that had characterized all of Rapture's great celebrations. As the New Year's Eve festivities of 1958 brought together the city's elite in a final display of the cultural sophistication and technological achievement that had once made the underwater metropolis the envy of anyone who had been privileged to witness its marvels. The Kashmir Restaurant, Rapture's most exclusive dining establishment, had been decorated with elaborate Art Deco ornamentations and festive lighting that transformed the elegant venue into a glittering showcase of human creativity and material prosperity. While the guest list included every important figure in the city's political, economic, and cultural hierarchies, the atmosphere of celebration that pervaded the Kashmir Restaurant reflected both genuine optimism about Rapture's future prospects and a desperate desire to recapture the sense of unity and shared purpose that had characterized the community during its golden years. As residents who had been increasingly divided by political disagreements and economic inequalities sought to temporarily set aside their differences in pursuit of the collective joy that had once defined their society. The conversations that took place among the assembled dignitaries covered topics ranging from scientific breakthroughs and artistic achievements to business opportunities and political developments, while the elaborate menu that had been prepared for the occasion featured delicacies and luxury items that demonstrated the continued prosperity that genetic enhancement and technological innovation had brought to those who had been able to participate successfully in Rapture's evolving economy. Andrew Ryan's own mood during the early hours of the celebration reflected his complex emotional state as the architect of a society that had achieved unprecedented technological and cultural advancement while also generating the social tensions and moral compromises that now threatened to tear apart everything he had worked to create. The speech that he delivered to the assembled guests emphasized themes of collective achievement and shared destiny that represented a significant departure from his usual focus on individual accomplishment and competitive excellence, suggesting that the pressures of governing Rapture had forced him to recognize the importance of social cohesion and mutual support in maintaining the stability of even the most advanced civilizations. But the apparent harmony and celebration that characterized the Kashmir Restaurant gathering masked the growing tensions and preparations for violence that were developing throughout the rest of Rapture, as Atlas and his revolutionary organization had been planning for months to use the New Year's Eve celebrations as the occasion for a devastating attack that would demonstrate the vulnerability of Ryan's government, while also eliminating many of the key figures who supported the existing social and political order. The intelligence network that Atlas had developed within Rapture's service industries and security apparatus had provided detailed information about the guest list and security arrangements for the Kashmir Restaurant event, enabling his organization to plan an operation that would maximize casualties among Ryan's supporters while minimizing the risk of capture or retaliation. The explosive device that Atlas's demolition experts had prepared for the Kashmir Restaurant attack represented months of careful planning and technical preparation, as the bomb had been designed not only to cause maximum structural damage and human casualties, but also to create the kind of spectacular destruction that would serve as a powerful symbol of the revolutionary movement's capability and determination. The placement of the device within the restaurant's infrastructure had required the cooperation of service workers and maintenance personnel who had been recruited through a combination of ideological persuasion and financial incentives, while the timing mechanism had been calibrated to ensure detonation during the peak moment of the celebration, when the maximum number of important targets would be present in the confined space. The psychological impact that Atlas intended to achieve through this attack went far beyond the immediate tactical advantages of eliminating political opponents, as the destruction of Rapture's most exclusive social gathering was designed to demonstrate that no institution or individual was safe from revolutionary justice, and that the existing social order could be challenged and destroyed by Found for Eight, those who had been excluded from its benefits. The symbolic significance of targeting a celebration of prosperity and achievement would resonate throughout Rapture's population, sending a message that the economic inequalities and political oppression that characterized Ryan's government would no longer be tolerated by those who had been relegated to secondary status in their own society. The security measures that had been implemented to protect the Kashmir restaurant event reflected Ryan's growing awareness of the threats that his government faced from organized opposition movements. But the protocols that had been established were designed primarily to address conventional threats, such as individual assassins or small groups of terrorists, rather than the kind of sophisticated operation that Atlas had organized. The personnel who had been assigned to provide security for the event were experienced and well-trained, but their focus on protecting specific individuals rather than detecting structural threats meant that they were poorly positioned to identify and neutralize the kind of explosive device that had been concealed within the building's infrastructure. The moments before the explosion were marked by an almost surreal contrast between the elegant conversations and refined pleasures that occupied the restaurant's patrons, and the countdown to devastation that was occurring within the concealed timing mechanism of Atlas's bomb. As the civilized rituals of high society continued undisturbed, while the forces of revolutionary violence prepared to shatter the illusion of security and stability that had enabled Rapture's elite to maintain their comfortable existence, despite the growing desperation and anger that characterized the experiences of the city's working-class population. The explosion that destroyed the Kashmir restaurant and killed dozens of Rapture's most important citizens marked the beginning of a civil war that would consume the underwater city's resources and social fabric while transforming the elegant galleries and sophisticated cultural institutions that had once showcased human achievement into battlefields where desperate individuals fought for survival and ideological supremacy. The blast itself was visible throughout large sections of Rapture's residential and commercial districts, while the shockwaves that propagated through the city's structure caused damage to buildings and infrastructure that would never be fully repaired during the remaining years of the community's existence. The immediate aftermath of the Kashmir restaurant bombing revealed the extent to which Atlas's revolutionary organization had penetrated Rapture's social and economic institutions, as coordinated attacks throughout the city demonstrated that the New Year's Eve assault had been only the opening move in a comprehensive campaign designed to destroy Ryan's government and seize control of the underwater metropolis. The simultaneous explosions that damaged power plants, communication facilities, and transportation hubs created widespread chaos and confusion that prevented effective coordination of security responses, while also demonstrating the sophisticated planning and extensive resources that Atlas had assembled for his revolutionary campaign. The casualties that resulted from these coordinated attacks included not only political and economic leaders who had been specifically targeted by Atlas's organization, but also ordinary residents who had been caught in the crossfire between revolutionary forces and government security personnel, as the violence that erupted throughout Rapture's districts made no distinction between combatants and civilians. The medical facilities that had once represented the pinnacle of technological advancement in healthcare became overwhelmed by the number and severity of injuries that resulted from the bombing campaign, while the breakdown of normal social services made it increasingly difficult to provide basic necessities such as food, water, and shelter to the growing number of refugees who had been displaced by the violence. The propaganda war that accompanied the physical violence reflected the competing ideological visions that Ryan and Atlas offered for Rapture's future, as both sides sought to justify their actions and attract support from the city's population through appeals to principles and values that had been central to the original vision of the underwater community. Atlas's revolutionary rhetoric emphasized themes of economic justice and collective solidarity that appealed to residents who had been excluded from the benefits of genetic enhancement and technological progress, while Ryan's defense of the existing order stressed the importance of individual achievement and voluntary cooperation in maintaining the advanced civilization that distinguished Rapture from the failed societies of the surface world. The recruitment strategies that both sides employed during the early phases of the Civil War reflected their different approaches to motivation and organization. As Atlas's movement attracted supporters through promises of economic redistribution and social equality, while Ryan's forces relied primarily on appeals to patriotism and fear of chaos to maintain loyalty among those who had benefited from the existing system. The weapons and equipment that became available to both sides included not only conventional firearms and explosives, but also ADAM-based enhancement products and genetic modification technologies that transformed ordinary civilians into superhuman combatants whose capabilities exceeded anything that had been seen in previous conflicts. The splicers who emerged during this period of social breakdown represented the dark culmination of Rapture's experiment with genetic enhancement, as individuals who had become addicted to ADAM found themselves transformed into creatures that possessed tremendous physical capabilities, but had lost much of their humanity and rational judgment. These enhanced individuals became valuable assets for both sides in the conflict, as their superhuman strength and resistance to injury made them effective combatants despite their psychological instability and unpredictable behavior, while their desperation for continued access to ADAM made them willing to participate in increasingly extreme forms of violence. The urban warfare that consumed Rapture's elegant districts required both sides to adapt their tactics to the unique challenges posed by fighting in an enclosed underwater environment where structural damage could result in catastrophic flooding that would endanger everyone regardless of their political allegiances. The architectural features that had once showcased human creativity and engineering excellence became tactical obstacles and defensive positions, while the advanced technology that had made comfortable life possible in the deep ocean environment became vulnerable to sabotage and destruction that could eliminate essential services for entire sections of the city. The breakdown of essential services that resulted from the ongoing violence created humanitarian crises that affected all residents of Rapture, regardless of their political loyalties, as the disruption of power generation, water purification, and atmospheric processing systems made basic survival increasingly difficult throughout the underwater city. The expertise required to maintain and repair these complex systems had been concentrated among a relatively small number of technical specialists, many of whom had been killed or displaced during the initial phases of the conflict, creating knowledge gaps that made restoration of normal services extremely challenging, even during temporary ceasefires. The psychological toll of the Civil War extended far beyond the immediate trauma of violence and displacement, as the breakdown of social order and the collapse of shared values created existential crises for individuals who had invested their identities and hopes in the vision of Rapture as humanity's greatest achievement. The disillusionment that many residents experienced as they witnessed the destruction of their community was compounded by the recognition that the principles and ideals that had motivated their participation in Ryan's experiment had been corrupted by the same human weaknesses and moral failures that had characterized the surface world societies they had sought to escape. The flooding that began to affect various sections of Rapture as the structural damage from bombing and fighting accumulated represented both an immediate physical threat to the city's inhabitants and a powerful symbol of the failure of human ambition in the face of natural forces that could not be permanently conquered through technology and engineering. The ocean that had once been held at bay by the strength of human design and the power of advanced materials began to reclaim the spaces that had been carved from its domain, creating a constant reminder of the precarious nature of civilization and the ultimate futility of attempting to transcend the limitations that constrained human existence. The emergency protocols that had been established to deal with structural breaches and flooding proved inadequate for the scale and complexity of the damage that resulted from sustained combat operations, as the designers of these systems had not anticipated the possibility that Rapture's own residents would deliberately sabotage the infrastructure that maintained their collective survival. The pumping systems and atmospheric processes that had been built to handle normal operational stresses were overwhelmed by the combination of battle damage and systematic destruction, while the personnel who possessed the expertise necessary to coordinate emergency repairs were often unable to reach damaged areas due to ongoing fighting or had been killed or wounded in the violence. The isolation that had originally protected Rapture from external interference now became a trap that prevented residents from escaping the violence and chaos that had consumed their community, as the complex systems required to maintain transportation between the underwater city and the surface world had been disrupted by the fighting, while the secrecy that had concealed Rapture's existence made it impossible to request assistance from external agencies that might have been able to provide humanitarian aid or refugee services. The residents who remained in the city were forced to choose between the competing factions that claimed to represent their interests, while those who sought neutrality found themselves increasingly vulnerable to violence from both sides. Ryan's personal transformation during this period reflected the psychological pressures and moral compromises that resulted from his efforts to maintain control over a society that was disintegrating despite his best efforts to preserve the vision that had motivated its creation. The man who had once celebrated individual freedom and voluntary cooperation was forced to rely increasingly on authoritarian measures and violence to suppress opposition to his authority, while his growing paranoia and isolation made it difficult for him to distinguish between genuine threats and imaginary conspiracies that existed primarily in his own traumatized imagination. The bunker complex that Ryan had constructed beneath his office building became both a command center for his war effort and a prison that isolated him from direct contact with the city and population he claimed to serve, as the security measures that protected him from assassination also prevented him from experiencing the reality of life in war-torn Rapture. The intelligence reports and status updates that he received from his subordinates provided only filtered and incomplete information about the true extent of the destruction and suffering that had resulted from the conflict, while his physical separation from the violence made it easier for him to rationalize increasingly extreme measures as necessary for protecting the greater good. The arrival of Jack in Rapture during the height of the Civil War represented the culmination of Fontaine's long-term strategy for destroying Ryan and seizing control of the underwater city, as the genetically modified assassin possessed both the security clearances necessary to penetrate Ryan's defenses and the psychological programming that would compel him to carry out his mission regardless of any personal connections or moral reservations that might otherwise have prevented him from committing patricide. The circumstances of Jack's arrival disguised as a random plane crash that brought an innocent surface dweller into contact with Rapture, provided the perfect cover for an infiltration operation that would have been impossible to execute through conventional means. The investigation that Ryan launched to determine Jack's identity and purposes reflected his growing desperation to understand and control the forces that were destroying his life's work, as the appearance of an unknown individual with apparent access to Rapture's most secure areas suggested either a massive failure of security systems or the existence of threats that had not been previously identified or addressed. The resources that Ryan devoted to researching Jack's background demonstrated both his recognition of the potential danger that this mysterious figure represented and his confidence that understanding his enemy's methods and motivations would enable him to develop effective countermeasures. The gradual realization that Jack was his own son, genetically modified and psychologically programmed to serve as an instrument of his destruction, represented the ultimate personal and philosophical crisis. For a man whose entire worldview had been based on the belief that individual merit and rational self-interest could create perfect societies when freed from the interference of parasitic institutions and collectivist ideologies, the discovery that his greatest enemy had been able to corrupt the most fundamental human relationship and turn his own flesh and blood into a weapon against him forced Ryan to confront the possibility that his understanding of human nature and social organization had been fatally flawed from the beginning. The self-destruct sequence that Ryan activated in response to this revelation represented both a final act of defiance against those who sought to steal his achievement and a recognition that the vision he had pursued throughout his adult life could not be preserved in the face of the moral corruption and human weakness that had ultimately proven stronger than technological advancement and philosophical sophistication. The decision to destroy Rapture rather than allow it to fall into the hands of his enemies reflected Ryan's commitment to the principle that individual creators had the right to control the fate of their achievements, even if that control extended to their complete annihilation. As the underwater city that had once represented humanity's greatest technological and social achievement entered the final phases of its existence, the sounds of battle and destruction that echoed through its flooded corridors served as a funeral dirge for the dreams and ambitions that had motivated its creation, while the desperate struggles of its remaining inhabitants demonstrated both the resilience and the futility of human efforts to transcend the limitations and contradictions that had characterized civilization throughout its entire history. On Earth and beneath the unforgiving waters of the Atlantic Ocean, the journey that brought Jack through the decaying corridors of Rapture toward his final encounter with Andrew Ryan was a passage not merely through physical space, but through the ruins of humanity's most ambitious dream, as every step carried him deeper into a city that had once represented the pinnacle of human achievement, but now served as a tomb for the ideals and aspirations that had motivated its creation. The flooded galleries and damaged structures that he navigated bore witness to the violence and chaos that had consumed the underwater metropolis, while the bodies of splicers and security personnel that littered his path provided grim testimony to the cost of the civil war that had torn apart the community that Ryan had believed would endure forever. The architectural grandeur that had once inspired visitors to Rapture with its demonstration of human creativity and technological mastery now created an atmosphere of melancholy and loss, as the elegant Art Deco designs and sophisticated engineering solutions that had showcased civilization's capacity for beauty and functionality were slowly being reclaimed by the ocean that surrounded them. The water that seeped through damaged seals and broken barriers served as a constant reminder of the precarious nature of human achievements in the face of natural forces that could not be permanently conquered, while the failing electrical systems and malfunctioning atmospheric processes created an environment of uncertainty and danger that reflected the broader collapse of the social and political order that had once governed this underwater paradise. The audio diaries and personal recordings that Jack encountered during his journey through the city provided fragments of the stories and experiences that had shaped the lives of Rapture's residents during both its golden years et violent déclin, creating a haunting chronicle of hopes betrayed and dreams destroyed by the same human weaknesses that had plagued civilizations throughout history. The voices of scientists and artists, businessmen and laborers that spoke from these recorded testimonies revealed the complex mixture of idealism and selfishness, brilliance and folly that had characterized the community Ryan had assembled in his attempt to create a perfect society free from the corruptions and limitations of the surface world. Meanwhile, in the executive offices of Ryan Industries that overlooked the central plaza, where Rapture's citizens had once gathered to celebrate their achievements and share their vision of humanity's future, Andrew Ryan himself was experiencing the final hours of his existence in a state of philosophical and emotional isolation that reflected both his intellectual understanding of the forces that had destroyed his life's work and his psychological inability to accept responsibility for the role that his own decisions and character flaws had played in bringing about this catastrophic conclusion. The man who had once commanded the loyalty and admiration of the world's most talented individuals now found himself alone with his thoughts and his failures, surrounded by the symbols of power and achievement that had lost all meaning in the face of the disaster that was consuming everything he had worked to create. The golf clubs that Ryan had arranged in his office served not merely as recreational equipment, but as symbols of the leisurely pursuits and civilized pleasures that his underwater city had been designed to make possible for those who possessed the intelligence and determination necessary to earn their place in this selective community. The game of golf itself represented the kind of refined activity that distinguished advanced civilizations from primitive societies, requiring patience, skill, and strategic thinking, while also providing opportunities for contemplation and social interaction that enhanced the quality of life for those who had transcended the basic struggles for survival that occupied most of humanity's attention and energy. The ritual of playing one final round of golf in the face of approaching death reflected Ryan's commitment to maintaining his dignity and composure, even as the world he had created collapsed around him, demonstrating the kind of philosophical fortitude that he believed distinguished superior individuals from the masses who allowed circumstances to determine their responses to adversity. The careful attention that he devoted to each shot and the precise form that he maintained throughout his final game represented his determination to control those aspects of his existence that remained within his power, while also providing him with a meditative activity that enabled him to prepare mentally and emotionally for the confrontation that he knew was approaching. The self-destruct sequence that Ryan had activated represented both a practical response to the threat posed by Jack's infiltration and a symbolic gesture that reflected his philosophical conviction that creators possess the by absolute right to determine the fate of their achievements, including the right to destroy them rather than allow them to be appropriated by those who had not earned ownership through their own efforts and sacrifices. The countdown that had been initiated would ensure that Rapture's advanced technology and accumulated knowledge would be destroyed, rather than falling into the hands of Atlas and his revolutionary organization, while also providing Ryan with the satisfaction of denying his enemies the prize that they had sought to claim through violence and deception. The technical systems that would accomplish this destruction had been designed with the same attention to detail and engineering excellence that had characterized every aspect of Rapture's construction, ensuring that the process would be thorough and irreversible, while also providing sufficient time for Ryan to complete his personal business and prepare for his own death with the dignity that he believed his achievements and principles deserved. The explosives and structural failures that would tear apart the city's foundation had been calculated to prevent any possibility of salvage or reconstruction, while the flooding that would follow would ensure that the ocean reclaimed the space that human ambition had temporarily conquered through intelligence and determination. The audio recording system that Ryan had activated to document his final thoughts and philosophical reflections represented his desire to leave behind some record of the insights and understanding that he had gained through his experiences as the creator and leader of humanity's most advanced civilization, providing future generations with the benefit of lessons learned through unprecedented experimentation with social organization and human enhancement. The words that he spoke into this recording device reflected both his pride in what Rapture had achieved during its brief existence and his recognition of the tragic irony that the very success of his vision had created the conditions that made its destruction inevitable. The philosophical analysis that Ryan articulated in these final recordings addressed the fundamental contradictions between individual freedom and collective security that had plagued his attempts to create a perfect society, acknowledging that the human nature he had sought to liberate from external constraints had ultimately proven to be constrained by internal weaknesses that no amount of technological advancement or social engineering could eliminate. The insights that he offered about the relationship between power and corruption, achievement and envy, progress and tradition, represented the distillation of decades of experience with the practical challenges of translating idealistic visions into functional realities. The sound of Jack's footsteps approaching through the corridors outside Ryan's office created a rhythm that seemed to mark the final moments of the philosophical experiment that had begun with such hope and ambition more than a decade earlier. As each step brought closer, the confrontation between creator and creation that would determine whether Ryan's vision could survive in any form, or whether it would be completely extinguished by the forces of destruction and appropriation that had always threatened human achievement. The steady progression of these footsteps through the damaged and flooded sections of the building provided a counterpoint to Ryan's own calm preparations, creating a sense of inevitability and destiny that transformed what might have been merely a violent encounter between enemies into a moment of profound historical and philosophical significance. The security systems that should have protected Ryan's office from unauthorized intrusion had been designed to respond to his genetic signature, making them useless against an infiltrator who possessed the same DNA patterns that had been programmed into the electronic locks and biometric scanners that controlled access to the most sensitive areas of Rapture's infrastructure. The irony of this vulnerability was not lost on Ryan, whose understanding of Jack's true identity had provided him with a clear comprehension of how his most carefully planned security measures had been turned against him through the exploitation of his own biological characteristics and the corruption of the most fundamental human relationships. The door that separated Ryan from his approaching assassin represented more than a simple physical barrier, serving as the final boundary between the world of idealistic vision that had motivated Rapture's creation and the harsh reality of human nature that had ultimately destroyed it, while also symbolizing the tragic inevitability of conflict between generations and the inability of even the most brilliant individuals to control the long-term consequences of their decisions and actions. The opening of this door would mark the end of one era and the beginning of another, though whether what followed would represent progress or regression remained to be determined by forces beyond any individual's ability to predict or control. The moment when Jack finally entered Ryan's office and stood face to face with the man whose genetic material had been stolen and manipulated to create him represented the convergence of all the themes and contradictions that had shaped Rapture's brief but extraordinary existence, as the meeting between father and son embodied both the potential for human achievement and the inevitability of human failure that had characterized every aspect of the underwater city's history. The physical resemblance between the two men served as a visual reminder of their biological connection, while the psychological and philosophical differences that separated them reflected the extent to which environment and conditioning could override inherited characteristics in determining individual identity and behavior. The recognition that dawned in Jack's consciousness as Ryan began to speak represented both a moment of personal revelation and a broader awakening to the nature of identity and free will that had implications extending far beyond their immediate situation, as the realization that his entire existence had been shaped by forces beyond his knowledge or control forced him to confront fundamental questions about responsibility and choice that philosophers and scientists had debated for centuries, without reaching definitive conclusions. The confusion and disorientation that accompanied this recognition reflected the psychological trauma of discovering that one's most basic assumptions about oneself and one's purpose were based on elaborate deceptions and based manipulations. The explanation that Ryan provided about the nature of Jack's conditioning and the purpose for which he had been created served not merely as exposition about past events, but as a philosophical meditation on the relationship between freedom and determinism, choice and compulsion, that had been central to Rapture's social experiment from its inception. The phrases that Ryan repeated about men choosing and slaves obeying took on new meaning in the context of Jack's programmed responses, demonstrating how language itself could become a tool for controlling behavior, while also revealing the subtle ways in which apparent choices could be manipulated by those who understood the mechanisms that governed human decision-making. The golf club that Ryan handed to Jack represented both a practical weapon for accomplishing the assassination and a symbolic transfer of responsibility and authority from one generation to the next, as the older man acknowledged his failure to protect his achievements from those who sought to appropriate them, while also recognizing that the younger generation would have to find its own path forward from the ruins of his ambitions. The weight of the club in Jack's hands served as a physical manifestation of the burden of choice that confronted him, while the smooth surface of the grip provided tactile evidence of the craftsmanship and attention to detail that had characterized every aspect of Rapture's construction and operation. The command that Ryan spoke, compelling Jack to kill him, through the activation of the psychological programming that had controlled his behavior since childhood, represented both the ultimate assertion of paternal authority and the complete abdication of that authority, as the father simultaneously commanded and released his son, while also demonstrating the extent to which both of their lives had been shaped by forces beyond their individual control. The tragic irony of this moment lay in the fact that Ryan's death would accomplish exactly what his enemies had intended, while also denying them the satisfaction of personally destroying the man whose vision and determination had created everything they sought to control. The physical act of violence that followed Ryan's command was simultaneously an expression of filial obedience and parricide, mechanical compliance and emotional release, as Jack found himself unable to resist the neurological compulsions that had been implanted in his consciousness, while also experiencing the full weight of what he was being forced to do to the man who had given him life. The blood that flowed from Ryan's wounds served as both evidence of his mortality and symbol of the genetic connection that bound him to his killer, while the silence that followed the violence provided a moment of reflection on the meaning and consequences of what had just occurred. The death of Andrew Ryan marked not merely the end of an individual life, but the conclusion of one of the most ambitious social and technological experiments in human history, As the man whose vision had inspired the creation of Rapture took with him the philosophical framework and moral authority that had provided meaning and direction for the entire enterprise, the body that remained in the elegant office overlooked a city that had already begun to die along with its creator, while the ideas and achievements that had made Rapture possible would survive only as fragments and memories that future generations might study, but could never fully reconstruct or replicate. The silence that settled over the office in the aftermath of Ryan's death was broken only by the distant sounds of structural collapse and flooding that marked the final stages of Rapture's physical destruction, as the self-destruct sequence that had been initiated continued its inexorable countdown toward the moment when the ocean would reclaim the space that human ambition had briefly conquered through intelligence and determination. The elegant furnishings and technological marvels that had once demonstrated civilization's highest achievements would soon be scattered across the ocean floor, serving as archaeological evidence of humanity's capacity for both greatness and self-destruction. The philosophical questions that Ryan's death left unanswered would continue to resonate long after the physical evidence of his achievements had been destroyed, as future thinkers and social theorists would debate whether his vision had been flawed from its inception, or whether it had been corrupted by the same human weaknesses that had plagued every attempt to create perfect societies throughout history. The tragedy of Rapture lay not in any single error of judgment or character flaw, but in the broader human condition that made it impossible to achieve lasting perfection through technological advancement alone, without addressing the fundamental moral and psychological challenges that had shaped human behavior since the beginning of civilization. As Jack stood over the body of the man who had been both his creator and his victim, the weight of understanding and responsibility that settled upon his shoulders represented both the burden and the opportunity that confronted anyone who survived the collapse of one's social order and faced the challenge of creating something new from its ruins. The choices that lay ahead would determine whether the lessons of Rapture's rise and fall could contribute to human progress, or whether they would be forgotten in the chaos and destruction that had consumed Andrew Ryan's underwater paradise, leaving future generations to repeat the same mistakes and suffer the same tragic consequences that had brought this extraordinary experiment to its inevitable and devastating conclusion. In the silence that follows the telling of Andrew Ryan's tale, we are left not with simple condemnation or easy answers, but with the profound questions that his life embodied. Here was a man who had witnessed humanity at its worst, the theft of property, the murder of family, the crushing weight of tyranny, and had dedicated his existence to creating something better. Yet, in his very attempt to escape the parasites and tyrants of the surface world, he became the greatest parasite and tyrant of all, feeding on the dreams and freedom of those who trusted in his vision. The underwater tomb of Rapture stands as testament to the terrible truth that our greatest virtues, when taken to their absolute extreme, become our most destructive vices. Ryan's story reminds us that the line between visionary and monster is thinner than we dare imagine, and that even the noblest ideals can become instruments of oppression when wielded by hands that have forgotten their humanity. In the crushing depths where his dream lies drowned, Andrew Ryan achieved a kind of immortality, not as the great man he believed himself to be, but as a warning about the price of moral certainty in an uncertain world.